Welcome to History at the OK Corral. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, leave us a comment down below, and share this episode with a fellow history lover. And now, on to tonight's episode. The course of human history is wrought with conflicts filled with brutal, bloody encounters. Some of these manifest in huge battles, fought with massive armies under legendary generals and heads of state. And some are a collection of smaller-scale guerrilla warfare between two parties intent on victory at nearly any cost. Among these, few wars in history have been as vicious and as violent as the decades-long conflict waged between the Texas Rangers and the Comanche. Here now, History at the OK Corral brings you 10 legendary tales of their most vicious fights. Central Texas, winter, 1839. Texas Ranger Andrew Lockhart stands ensconced in a deadly fight, with bullets and arrows flying all around. Lockhart is part of an assaulting force of Rangers and Lipan Apache who have ventured here to the San Gabriel River, roughly 100 miles north of Austin, with the intent of pursuing and engaging a party of Comanche who have been raiding in the area in the previous few weeks. Now, with the Comanche being completely unaware of their presence and mostly just rising from a night's sleep, the Rangers have caught them off guard. All throughout the village, women and children scatter, warriors attack and are shot down and clubbed, and war cries and death howls abound. However, Andrew Lockhart barely notices either the cacophony nor the danger about him, as he fires upon any warrior he can find, and screams, unconsciously and incessantly, for his daughter. "Matilda! Matilda! If you are here, run to me!" Again and again the desperate father screams, seemingly unconcerned with the actions of his cohorts or their commander. It has been nearly a year since he has seen the teenage girl, one in which he has slept little and thought of virtually nothing else but her welfare and rescue. Andrew Lockhart had moved to Texas from Illinois in 1828, settling in the DeWitt colony on the Guadalupe River. Here, he and his wife had raised their children, the eldest among whom being Matilda, who records hold as being somewhere between 14 and 16 years of age. The previous fall, Matilda and 4 children from the neighboring Putnam family, Rhoda Putnam, aged 14, James Putnam, aged 7, Elizabeth Putnam, aged 5, and Lucy Putnam, aged 2, had ventured out amongst the nearby pecan groves on the banks of the Guadalupe River to engage in the time-honored tradition of gathering pecans. While the group was concentrated on their task at hand, they fell victim to a band of Comanche raiders who had hidden themselves in the brush nearby. While the 3 youngest Putnam children, James, Elizabeth, and Lucy, were fallen upon and swept up by the Comanche within moments, Matilda had first attempted to make a break for their home, in hopes of alerting her father to what had happened. The cries of her friend Rhoda Putnam, however, caused her to lose heart in this pursuit and return to try and assist her friend in escaping. This fateful decision resulted in both of them being captured, and within minutes, all 5 of the terrified and crying children were strapped to the back of Comanche ponies. The party of Comanche and captives then made their way due west at top speed, traveling long and hard on the ever more sparse and unforgiving landscape. As they traveled, rescue efforts were already being organized, though to little effect. When the Putnams and Lockharts met later that day, both families in virtual hysterics over the state of their missing children, they found there to be frustratingly few options for retribution at their disposal. Though they certainly desired to pursue the Comanche immediately, doing so would leave the family members left behind in danger of a second attack. They would need assistance. This assistance would come in the form of Captain John Tumlinson, who arrived with his small surveying party of 6 men. Tumlinson and his men had been surveying the area west of San Antonio when they had narrowly missed being overrun themselves by the Comanche raiding party that had taken Matilda Lockhart and the Putnam children. When they arrived on the west banks of the Guadalupe River, they found all of the homesteads on that side. News of the abductions had spread like wildfire, causing those on the western side of the river to cross to the eastern side and congregate at the homestead of another DeWitt colony settler, William Taylor. Several of the men of DeWitt's colony and Tumlinson's survey party immediately organized a rescue party, crossing the river again and taking to the trail of the Comanche as quickly as it could be discerned. Though the men put forth their utmost efforts in pursuing the Comanche and the stolen children, it was soon apparent that these efforts were in vain. The children were gone. lost into the vast expanses of the Texas frontier, and it was very likely that they would never be seen again. It was well known amongst all of the settlers what kind of treatment would be in store for the captives, and now all the grieving family could do was wait, hope, and pray for their safe return. The children, meanwhile, were now tasked with surviving amongst a wholly new and harshly unforgiving reality. Comanche treatment of captives varied wildly with consideration to age and gender. Most captured infants were summarily and cruelly dispatched by the Comanche, who saw the care required for a child of that age as too much of a hindrance while on the rapid egress after their capture. Older children, however, after an initial period of ingratiation, were often adopted into the tribe. With notoriously low birth rates due to their nomadic, horse-bound lifestyle and an existence built entirely around hunting and warfare, the Comanche were often all too willing to adopt captives from other tribes, as well as Spanish, Anglo, and Mexican captives. Adult women would find themselves relegated to miserable existences as slaves, sexual and otherwise, to their captors. Men would generally be tortured to death via any number of unthinkable methods, such as stretching a victim out on the ground and heaping hot coals upon them, or slowly filleting them alive. In the case of Matilda Lockhart and the 4 Putnam children, their treatment would largely follow this protocol. The 3 youngest Putnam children, James, Elizabeth, and Lucy, were quickly adopted into the tribe, where they would live for many years. Rhoda Putnam and Matilda Lockhart, however, were afforded no such kind treatment. Though no record exists of their chastity being violated, physical abuse of other kinds abounded for both unfortunate young women. They were routinely made to travel from 50 to 75 miles a day on horseback over rough territory, forced to do the dirtiest jobs in camp, such as tanning hides and carrying water, and routinely tortured via beatings and burnings. While his daughter endured the hardships of life as a prisoner amongst the Comanche, Andrew Lockhart was left with the unenviable task of caring for his wife and remaining 8 children while attempting to keep abreast of any search parties being formed, or recent news of his daughter's whereabouts. It would be an entire year before word of a local party of Texas Rangers and Lipan Apache scouts arrived at the Lockhart homestead, and Andrew Lockhart hurried out to join them. The Rangers were in pursuit of another raiding party of Comanche, who had again spent the preceding months incessantly raiding and killing the Texan homesteaders. Captain William Mosby Eastland had mustered 30 men from the nearby town of LaGrange, while another force of 30 men had been assembled in Bastrop, with this force being led by Ranger Noah Smithwick. The Rangers and their Lipan Apache scouts, longtime enemies of the Comanche, all rode under the overall command of Colonel John H. Moore, a veteran of the Texas Revolution and prominent leader in the Battle of Gonzales. Indignant at the personal and collective toll the Comanche raiding parties have exacted upon them over the previous weeks, months, and years, the heavily armed party then made its way north to the San Gabriel River. Though the weather was cold and sleeting, and conditions seemed only to worsen with every passing hour, the party remained resolute in pursuing their quarry. The Lipan Apache scouts, exemplifying extraordinary endurance and courage, ventured miles out ahead of the main body in order to reconnoiter the surrounding area. They initially reported the camp as being further south on the San Gabriel River. However, upon reaching the location, the Rangers and scouts found the Comanche had moved their camp. The following is an excerpt from Noah Smithwick's personal accounts of the events, taken from his memoirs entitled The Evolution of a State. When we reached the point at which the Lipans reported the camp, the Comanches had moved, leaving a trail leading upstream. We followed on up on the head of the San Gabriel, where we were now taken by a storm of snow and sleet, which was so severe we were obliged to take shelter. We made for a grove of post oaks on the divide between the San Gabriel and the Colorado, in the shelter of which we struck camp. The storm continued with increasing cold. Some of the horses froze to death, and the Indians, loath to see so much good meat go to waste, ate the flesh. During their tedious and blustery day, a rifle which had been leaned up upon one of the post oak trees fell to the ground and discharged. One of Captain Eastland's Rangers, a young man whose name has been lost to posterity, was tragically struck in the torso by the errant shot and gravely wounded. Finally, after 3 days of enduring freezing temperatures, snow, and the rapidly declining health of their comrade, the conditions cleared sufficiently for the men in the camp to move out. Smithwick's account continues. Our men had constructed a rawhide boat and started our wounded man down the Colorado in charge of 2 comrades. The poor young fellow, whose name I do not now remember, died on the way down and was buried in the sand. We saddled up and started for the Comanche camp, going up within a few miles of the place when we halted and lay on our firearms, while Malcolm Hornsby, Joe Martin, and 2 Lipan went forward after dark to locate the exact position of the camp. On their return, they reported a much larger camp than the Lipans previously reported. Disconcerted by the unexpected intelligence, Colonel Moore rather demurred to attack, but we had come out to hunt a fight and were willing to take the responsibility. One big, rough fellow said he did not care if there were 1,000 of them if there were horses enough to justify the fight. When within a mile of the camp, we dismounted and tied our horses. We then crept up upon the sleeping Indians, who were not dreaming of an attack. As soon as daylight gave us the exact situation of the camp, we made a rush for it, pouring a volley right into the lodges. Taken completely by surprise, the savages bounded from their lodges and scattered like partridges. Our men rushed right in among the lodges, the women and children screaming, dogs barking, men yelling and shooting, in a moment transformed the peaceful scene on which the day had just but dawned into a pandemonium. In this pandemonium, Andrew Lockhart now rushes about the village, desperately crying out for his lost daughter. As the seconds tick by, his anxiety and despair rise higher and higher, rendering everything around him nearly inaudible and indiscernible. Suddenly, for reasons inexplicable to everyone but the commander himself, Colonel Moore orders a retreat, commanding the men to move back to the cover of a timbered thicket near the village. Lockhart and the rest of the Rangers, confused and indignant, nonetheless withdraw to the thicket, losing both their advantage in position and surprise. Many of the Lipan Apache present are disgusted by this order and decide to leave the battlefield. However, while on their egress, they manage to stampede a significant portion of the Comanche horse herd, rendering most of their warriors footbound. The Comanche, still reeling but incensed, now marshal their forces in a line of warriors and advance upon the thicket. As this contingent advances upon the Rangers, another group of Comanche make their way around the backside of the thicket and scatter every one of the Rangers' horses. As this happens, a charge is made by the Comanche to the front of the thicket, and a volley of fire pours out of the Ranger positions, killing several of the warriors and rendering one unfortunate Comanche paralyzed on the field of battle between the 2 parties. The wounded Comanche, in a startling display of warrior spirit, fires arrows in high arcs into the thicket, all while laying on his back. This grisly scene was soon concluded when one of the Lipan Apache warriors, a famed chief by the name of Flacco, rushed forward to dispatch the Comanche with a lance. After this, the Comanche attack momentarily abates, as both sides withdraw to their respective positions. Finally, a Lipan Apache woman, a prisoner of the Comanche, walks out of the village, towards the thicket, waving a white flag of truce. One of the Lipan Apache scouts ventures forward and briefly converses with her. She tells him the Comanche have lost many of their best warriors and inquires as to the losses of the Rangers and Lipan Apache. The Lipan Apache keenly informs her, in a cunning lie, that his party has not received so much as a flesh wound. This, however, is not true. Felix Taylor, a longtime Ranger, has been shot in the knee, and Joe Martin, who Noah Smithwick notes as one of our best men, has received a shot to the back, rendering him paralyzed from the waist down and in excruciating pain. He begs his comrades to dispatch him in the name of decency and mercy, but none abide his wishes. Martin then insists that he be given a pistol so that he may end his own suffering, but is told only to, quote, bear up bravely, and that he would be returned home. Now, the Rangers find themselves in an incredibly precarious situation. They are at least 100 miles away from the closest town in Austin, Texas, completely on foot, and with 2 wounded and immobile comrades in tow. Now, they must make their way back south, under the constant threat of Comanche reprisal. This reprisal, however, does not come. Though the party will indeed return safely to Austin, the specter of the tragedies related to the fight that day will loom large for weeks and months to come. Joseph Martin will make it home, only to perish a scant few weeks later from his horrific wound. And while Martin's agonizing demise is certainly the stuff of nightmares, it is Andrew Lockhart whose grief will only intensify. Noah Smithwick's account of Lockhart at the fight is all too humanizing in its tragic circumstances. I never felt sorrier for a man than I did for Colonel Lockhart, whose young daughter had been taken captive by the Comanches, and who we had every reason to believe was in that camp. His feeling that he was indeed so close to his beloved daughter would be proven tragically correct when, a little over a year later, Matilda Lockhart would finally be returned to her family in an exchange with the Comanche organized in San Antonio in the spring of 1840. Even this long-awaited reunion, however, would be marred by the cruelty and dehumanization that is inherently linked to human conflict throughout history. One account of her appearance that day, given by noted Texas luminary Mary Maverick, paints a visceral image of the severity and totality of the abuse wrought upon Matilda Lockhart during her captivity. She was in a frightful condition, poor girl. Her head, arms, and face were full of bruises and sores, and her nose actually burnt off to the bone, all the fleshy end gone, and a great scab formed at the end of the bone. Both nostrils were wide open and denuded of flesh. She told a piteous tale of how dreadfully the Indians had beaten her, and how they would wake her from sleep by sticking a chunk of fire to her flesh, especially to her nose. Ah, it was sickening to behold, and made one's blood boil for vengeance. All of the Putnam children would eventually be returned, largely against their will. Even Rhoda, the teenage girl who was roughly the same age as Matilda, would go on to marry a chief and was loath to return to Anglo society. Matilda's return, however, would spark one of the most violent, calamitous instances in the history of the Old West, in what would come to be known as the Council House Fight, a veritable bloodbath in which Comanche were hunted down in the streets of San Antonio. In response to this, the settlements surrounding San Antonio and Austin were besieged for weeks by some of the most horrific attacks the Texans had seen yet. In the scope of Texas history, these events would mark only the early stages of what would become a decades-long war for the Lone Star State. We here at HOKC have covered some of these events before, and you can find links to our videos on the Council House Fight as well as the Battle of Plum Creek in the description below. But the countless other tales of terror, tragedy, cunning, and courage are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Bastrop, Texas, February 24th, 1839. In the late winter chill of a placid evening, the citizens of this small village east of Austin find themselves largely engaged with chores and preparations for evening meals. While Texas is an independent republic, having established its independence from Mexico in the Texas Revolution of 1836, it is still a slave-holding territory. Several of the wealthier citizens of Bastrop are slave owners, and thus many of the local inhabitants are slaves, subject to the dehumanizing effects of chattel servitude, even here on the bleeding edges of Western civilization's westernmost expansion. Adding to the cultural milieu that is commonplace here in 1830s Texas are several Quiche natives, as well as Tejano citizens, native Texans of Hispanic descent. Though all are subject to the stratified racial and economic hierarchy of early 19th century America, here on the Texas frontier, they live under the auspices of a singular fear that is shared by all. That of the incessant, horrifically violent raiding being carried out all across the Texas frontier by the dreaded lords of the southern plains, the Comanche. Time and time again in the preceding decade, Texas settlers found themselves subject to acts of violence and degradation that had scarcely, if ever, been seen by their predecessors east of the Mississippi. Countless homesteads across the Texas frontier had been laid waste to, with entire families killed or carried off into slavery. Torture killings were common, as were all manner of assaults, including sexual and otherwise. The attacks did not discriminate by race, gender, social class, religious affiliation, nationality, nor age. The Apache, the Tonkawa, the Karankawa, the Spanish, and the Mexicans who have inhabited Texas since the early 18th century have all fallen victim to the Comanche. The inhabitants of central Texas in 1839 are but the latest iteration of a people living on the fringes of what had come to be known to the Spanish as Comancheria. The threat of raiding is in fact so pervasive that the town of Bastrop has its own warning system, instituted by Texas Ranger, Texas Revolution veteran, and Texas Army Chief of Staff, Colonel Edward Burleson. In the event of a Comanche raiding party being sighted, citizens are instructed to sound off with a long retort from a bugle-like brass horn, followed by 2 gunshots in rapid succession. Upon hearing this, the neighboring homestead is to repeat the signal until it reaches the vicinity of the town of Bastrop itself. Here, a small cannon will be fired, serving as the call for the local men to muster and prepare for a Comanche attack. However, as the hue of dusk begins to settle over the city of Bastrop and its surrounding farms and plantations, the threat of Comanche violence seems a world away. Then, suddenly, just as most of the town's inhabitants are getting ready to settle in for their evening meal, the high-pitched, monotone intonations of a bugle can be heard in the distance, followed quickly by 2 gunshots. Less than a minute later, even nearer to the center of town, the same piercing retort of a bugle, followed by 2 gunshots, can be heard. Moments later, the cacophonous rumble of a small cannon can be heard roaring from the center of town. The Comanche, it seems, have struck again. As the fighting-age men assemble in the town square, word quickly circulates as to the cause of the alarm. A local family, the Colemans, have been attacked. Though not necessarily unique on the Texas frontier, the story that now spreads like wildfire through the town of Bastrop is sickeningly violent, and demonstrative of the extremely violent, often macabre nature of Comanche raids in Texas. A combined force of Caddo, Waco, and Comanche raiders had struck the homestead of Elizabeth Coleman, a recently widowed mother, and her 5 children. Her eldest son James had been out in the Coleman's fields with a family friend named James Rogers, plowing rows for spring crops. They had been the first to be set upon by the Comanche, who cut them off from retreat to the family cabin. The 2 young men had made their escape through a thickly forested area, but would be too late in securing help for their loved ones. Minutes after abandoning the chase for Rogers and James Coleman, the large force of native warriors fell upon Elizabeth Coleman and her 4 younger children. Elizabeth and the children had been in front of the Coleman's family cabin, working in the garden situated roughly 50 yards from the door. Suddenly, the young mother and her children saw the blood-curdling sight of several hundred native warriors charging towards them at full speed. Elizabeth Coleman had screamed for the children to flee to the cabin, and all but the youngest, 5-year-old Thomas Coleman, had been able to make it. Thomas Coleman, however, was swooped up violently by a warrior on horseback. Seeing this, Elizabeth Coleman had turned course and attempted to help her youngest son. Within seconds of instinctually whirling about in order to pursue her captured child, she had been struck in the throat by an arrow. She had fled back to the cabin, making it through the door and helping her 12-year-old son, Albert Coleman, bar the door to prevent the attacking warriors, now dismounted and assaulting the front door, from gaining entry. Elizabeth had then collapsed, mortally wounded, as Albert Coleman gathered the 3 guns kept at the cabin. Amidst the shrieks of his siblings and the dire condition of his mother, 12-year-old Albert had put up a truly unbelievable fight against the Comanche and their native allies. He fired upon any warrior who managed to breach the door, killing one outright and wounding another. He then raised one of the cabin's floorboards and instructed his younger siblings to hide underneath them and to not make a sound until they heard voices speaking in English. The preteen boy then continued reloading and firing his weapons, pouring out such voluminous fire that the attacking warriors assumed there to be several grown men defending the cabin. Finally, however, young Albert was fatally wounded by a shot from one of the attacking warriors. With his last breaths, he reiterated his instructions to his siblings hidden beneath the floorboards before finally collapsing near the body of his mother. The attacking party of Comanche and their allies had then taken the young Thomas Coleman and carried their attack on to the neighboring farmstead of one Dr. Joseph Robertson. Robertson and his family were not home. However, there were several unfortunate slaves who, without access to firearms, were unable to proffer any kind of defense. 7 of them were summarily taken away by the attacking native forces, destined for lives as slaves amongst the Comanche and their allies. It would be late in the afternoon, several hours after the attack, that a young neighbor of the Colemans named John D. Anderson found the farmstead to be curiously silent and devoid of activity. He had been the first to discover the grisly scene at the Coleman cabin, and had managed to rescue the 2 youngest children hidden under the floorboards. From here, realizing the danger all 3 of them were now in, Anderson had set the youngsters astride his horse and made a mad dash to Wells Fort, roughly 12 miles to the west. From here, the children were placed under a guard and runners were sent out to the surrounding towns. These runners alerted the first homestead they had arrived at, initiating the chain of warning shots that now cuts through the air in Bastrop. The men from Bastrop and other surrounding counties coalesced their forces at Wells Fort. While gathered at the fort, Jacob Burleson, brother of the famed Colonel Edward Burleson, is elected to take command. Jacob Burleson and his company of rangers and ad hoc volunteers begin searching the area for the Comanche war party they know to be close by. The search continues into the night, and into the next morning, when finally, at about 10 a.m., the large raiding party is spotted near what is known as Post Oak Island, located roughly 4 miles north of Brushy Creek. Though much of the popular lore surrounding such encounters on the Texas frontier is centered on the actual combat, the biggest problem encountered by the Texans combating the Comanche and other native tribes was actually finding their adversary on the vast expanses of this seemingly endless landscape. With this foremost task now accomplished, the Texians pursue their quarry at full gallop. And a classic Comanche tactic, still relatively unknown to their Anglo adversaries in the 1830s, the Comanche now feign a full-scale retreat. The Comanche and their allies make a mad dash for a thickly wooded thicket, while the Texians, starting roughly from a half a mile behind, pursue them in a zigzag course, aiming to cut off any additional path of retreat. As the Texians proceed to within rifle range of the Comanche, they dismount and form a battle line. While this practice was common in the eastern woodlands, here on the open expanses of Texas, it is perhaps the biggest tactical blunder that can be made. As soon as the rangers' and volunteers' boots are on the ground, the Comanche and their allies immediately turn their ponies and make a headlong attack at the now foot-bound Texians. This catches the Texians off guard and sends the line of men scattering towards their own horses. One of the young rangers, a man by the name of W.S. Wallace, sees his horse panic and race off towards the Comanche lines, instantly becoming a trophy for the native forces. Now on foot and helpless, Wallace makes a sprint in the direction of his comrades in a desperate bid to escape. Seeing the dire straits of his compatriot, Captain Jack Haney turns his mount around, races back towards Wallace, and sweeps him onto his horse. The two narrowly escape a hail of Comanche arrows, which would have all but certainly resulted in grievous injury or death. Further down the Texian line, Captain Jacob Burleson, along with Franklin Highsmith and the teenaged Winslow Turner, arrive at their horses just in time to potentially evade the oncoming Comanche charge. However, in their panicked frenzy, the young Turner forgets to untie his horse, which is picketed to the ground. Seeing this, Captain Jacob Burleson turns, rushes back towards the youngster, dismounts, and unties the horse. Turner dashes off, but Jacob Burleson, just upon reaching his own horse, is struck by a gunshot in the back of his head. In the chaos of the retreat, his body is left where it falls. The rangers and volunteers now retreat, roughly 3 miles back towards Wells Fort, before stopping momentarily to rest their horses. As the horses rest, the rangers and volunteers descend into a malaise of anger, self-doubt, confusion, and contention. It is well known among them all that, at this very moment, the body of their countryman and comrade, Jacob Burleson, is being subject to all manner of posthumous mutilations by the Comanche. In both an effort to add literal insult to injury, as well as to hamper the person in the next life, many tribes customarily practice disfiguring the bodies of their slain enemies. The accounts of those Texas settlers who had found the bodies of their friends and family had circulated amongst every community on the frontier for many years, even at this point in the 1830s. The prevailing opinion amongst the rangers and volunteers alike is that the Comanche must be re-engaged. But the matter of exactly how to go about this presents a conundrum for the bellicose and indignant men. In the midst of contentious discussions on how to further proceed, at around noon, another force of 30 rangers and volunteers, riding under the command of Captain Jacob Burleson's brother, Colonel Edward Burleson, arrives. Informed of the death of his brother, Colonel Burleson marshals the combined forces, roughly 84 men in total, and the party makes their way back towards Brushy Creek. They ride past the brushy thicket, as well as the mutilated body of Jacob Burleson. Finding the thicket now empty, the Texians scan the surrounding countryside. They are met with yet another troubling, formidable sight. On the top of a large plateau near Brushy Creek, the Comanche and their allies have marshaled their forces into a large horseshoe formation, ready and waiting to receive the Rangers' forthcoming charge. Colonel Edward Burleson decides that he will divide his forces, he orders one of his officers, Captain Billingsley, to lead half of the men to attack the Comanche and their allies from below the plateau, while another contingent, led by Captain Rogers, will advance up a small ravine on the backside of the plateau. However, upon arriving at their tactical destinations, both officers find themselves roughly 50 yards from the entrenched Comanche position, with nothing but a coverless no-man's land in between the two parties. Now, an entrenched, prolonged battle drags out, with each side taking shots from their positions. One Comanche warrior in particular manages to kill 2 Texians and wound several others, acting as a masterful sniper with his single-shot rifle. Finally, young Winslow Turner locates the warrior's position from the gun smoke rising off of his weapon. Turner manages to climb a small tree, gain an advantage in position, and dispatch the sharpshooting Comanche with a carefully placed shot of his own. Finally, as the sun sets and night falls over the landscape, the Comanche and their allies retreat under cover of the night. As their enemies retreat, the Rangers and volunteers are met with the haunting, visceral cries of the Comanche themselves, mourning the loss of their own beloved friends and family who have fallen that day. In the aftermath of the fight, the brutal, inhumane nature of warfare on the Texas frontier is left all too apparent to the survivors present. The Rangers and volunteers now advance to the Comanche position, finding a singular survivor, one of the unnamed captured slaves taken by the Comanche the day prior. The man lies near death, with 9 arrows protruding from his body in various places. He has clearly been left for dead. But the man not only miraculously survives, he is able to give testimony to Colonel Burleson that the Comanche had carried off roughly 30 of their own dead. The Rangers and volunteers have, for their part, suffered 3 fatalities, including Jacob Burleson. One additional casualty, the Reverend James Gilleland, would die a little over a week later from the gunshot wound he incurred to his neck. In this world of cruelty, hardship, shifting alliances, and seemingly constant violence, the Battle of Brushy Creek provides a notable example of the multifaceted, cross-cultural, and cross-social nature of life on the Texas frontier in the 1830s. Even in the all-too-often macabre history of humanity, the tales of loss, tragedy, and survival in the history of Texas are notable in both scope and intensity. But the many tales of brutality, conflict, and cruelty that line the annals of Texas history are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Southwestern Texas, autumn, 1838. On the banks of the Pecos River, a hunting party of Delaware native tribesmen and a lone Texas Ranger relax in their camp, taking in the scenery and fine weather. The Texas Rangers as an organization and the Delaware have built up a close relationship over the preceding years, having the mutual interest of stemming the tide of violence being wrought over the whole of the Texas frontier by the fearsome and formidable lords of the southern plains, the Comanche. The Delaware warriors are members of a long-displaced Algonquin descendant people who had once inhabited the lands ranging from southern New York to the present-day state of Delaware. Though they refer to themselves as the Line-Lape or common people, they have come to be known as Delaware, as their first encounter with European settlers came on the banks of a bay named in honor of Lord de la Warr, governor of the English settlement at Jamestown in the year 1610. In the succeeding centuries, the Delaware have been driven southwest, first to the Ohio River Valley, with some moving to Missouri in the late 18th century. Members of this tribe eventually made their way south to Texas, where they had assimilated into many East Texas locales with the local Caddo tribe. They existed peaceably with Mexican officials and citizens, as well as their Texas successors. Their shared interest in combating the Comanche threat had garnered them several close friendships with the Rangers and among the surveyor parties who existed under the perpetual threat of a torturous, violent end at the hands of the Comanche. The Ranger here in camp today, accompanying this party of 18 Delaware warriors, is 21-year-old John Coffee Hayes, better known as Jack Hayes. Having moved to Texas only the year prior, Hayes has already cultivated a reputation as a steadfast gentleman and a hellacious combatant. Hayes hails from the woods of Tennessee, the product of a military family. His father had served under Andrew Jackson in the War of 1812 and he had been named after Jackson's famous Brigadier General John Coffee. When he arrived in Texas in 1837, he carried with him letters of recommendation from family who had close ties to then President of Texas, Sam Houston. Though his arrival saw him miss out on the preeminent events of the Texas Revolution, young Jack Hays has spent the previous year inexorably ensconced in combating the true biggest threat on the Texas frontier, the Comanche. The Comanche, a Shoshone offshoot who wandered down to Texas from the northern Rockies, had acquired horses from the Spanish in the 1600s and quickly became masters of the new animal and its potential. Though they had started out as a perpetually beleaguered people, subject to the violence and oppression of rival tribes, the introduction of the horse saw the Comanche rapidly ascend to primacy on the vast expanses of the southern plains. Their unique brand of whirlwind violence was not wrought upon Europeans alone, as tribes like the Apache, the Lipan Apache, the Wacos, and the Tarankawas suffered losses just as prevalent and as gruesome as their Spanish, American, French, and Mexican counterparts. This shared suffering led to alliances on the Texas frontier that many contemporary observers would view as unlikely. Such is the case with the young ranger in camp today on the Pecos River. His counterparts and the Delaware warriors accompanying him are not only allies, but close and trusted friends. Though large parts of their time are spent patrolling the areas west of San Antonio and Austin in search of raiding parties of Comanche, they have made this trip to the Pecos River, far west of the only notable settlements, purely in the interest of recreation. Their hope is to procure some of the bountiful game of the area, from bison to white-tailed deer, bear, bobcats, jaguars, and antelope. Hays and his comrades have so far spent this day lounging about camp, taking their rest from the long journey they had made from San Antonio. A journey they had made on foot, in hopes of keeping a lower profile and not traveling with a large horse herd that might prove more enticing to the Comanche than a small hunting party. The men congregate about the camp, checking their gear, trading jokes, or, in some cases, napping in the shade. The only ones among this party who seem eager to explore their new surroundings are two of the younger Delaware braves, who make their way downriver in hopes of taking stock of the local game and topography. Thus far, the day has been a welcome reprieve from the often unyielding stress of life on the Texas frontier, deep in the heart of what was known to the Spanish as Comancheria. Suddenly, though, this placid riverside campsite scene is shattered as the cries of one of the young Delaware warriors is suddenly heard above the sounds of quiet conversations and trickling water. The young man sprints into camp, covered in blood, breathlessly explaining how he and his Delaware comrade had been surprised by the Comanche. His friend is dead, he says, and he is lucky to have escaped with his life. He informs the men in the camp that the Comanche raiding party is now headed south, likely towards Chihuahua, Mexico. A vote is taken up amongst the Delaware, and it is unanimously decided that the hunt will be abandoned and that the Comanche will instead be pursued. Jack Hays has little choice. He indeed sees the value in seeking retribution, but his only option should he choose not to travel south with the Delaware will be to make his way back to San Antonio on foot, alone. In the end, there is little choice to be made. Hays joins the Delaware as they begin a dogged, sure-footed trot southwards through the sparse, rocky landscape in pursuit of the Comanche. The Delaware, with Hays in tow, keep up a slow but incessant jog that sees Hays tire after the first few hours. But the party carries on, without stopping for food or water until well into the night. Though he possesses formidable endurance, Hays is unused to this pace and duration of travel on foot. Soon, it is all he can do to match the footsteps of the Delaware warrior ahead of him as they plod southward. They stop only for minutes at a time, taking small bites of dried meat and resting briefly, before continuing on again. This withering pattern continues until noon the next day, when the party finally comes to rest at a freshwater spring. Here, they are able to finally drink their fill, and many of them lay down in the cool shade to sleep. Among these is Hays, who drops off into a deep sleep, thoroughly exhausted from the already monumental trek. In what seems like a fleeting few seconds, however, Hays is shaken awake. The sun has gone down, and the party is heading out, hitting the trail again at the same incessant trot. With little choice in the matter, Hays dutifully falls into line, again forcing himself to match the rhythm of the footsteps of the warrior ahead of him. For yet another night and day, the men travel on with the same routine. After resting on the second day, they again break camp, heading out into the moonlit night. Soon, however, they begin to smell the smoke of the campfires. Before long, the Delaware come to a halt and confer amongst themselves as to the exact plan of attack to be carried out upon the Comanche camp. It is decided that they will sneak into position inside of rifle range and ambush the Comanche at first light. The Delaware, with Hayes following suit, begin to literally inch their way towards the Comanche camp, crawling forward on their bellies in barely perceptible intervals. After what seems to Hayes like yet another eternity, the Delaware warrior next to him touches his shoulder, a silent signal that they need crawl no further. The party now watches and waits until sunrise. With the first few rays of morning light, the Delaware warriors and their Texas Ranger ally are ready. A signal is given to unleash a simultaneous volley into the Comanche camp, and while this initial volley sees only a few of the Comanche fall, the remainder of the camp is thrown into instant and abject chaos. The Comanche are unsure of exactly who is attacking them and of where the attack is coming from. Before this can be discerned, a second volley falls upon them, with more Comanche now falling to the ground, dead and dying, as their comrades scramble to mount a counterattack. Not wanting to afford their hated enemy the opportunity to mount their horses and escape, the Delaware warriors and Jack Hayes now make a daring, on-foot charge into the center of the Comanche camp, wielding pistols, knives, and tomahawks, intent on slaughtering the Comanche in retribution for their fallen comrade. The fight that unfolds is brutal, with the Comanche being cut down, scalped, and mutilated wholesale. Though the Comanche do put up a formidable resistance, it is soon clear that their fight is lost. With this realization, many of the warriors now break camp and make a run for the Pecos River. Several are headed off before reaching the water, and several more are clubbed down in the rock-strewn shallows of the river. In his book, Texas Ranger, Jack Hayes in the Frontier Southwest, author James Kimmons Greer sums up the fight thusly. The crunch of the light axe into skulls, or thrust of the long knife into backs of the Comanche warriors, brought dying screams and gasps. Some of the swifter braves reached the stream safely. Many of them were shot in the water. Very few escaped. Their need for vengeance now satiated, the party cuts their hunting trip short, making their way back north, back to San Antonio. For the Delaware, the coming months and years would see them expelled from Texas, victims of newly elected Republic of Texas President Mirabeau Lamar's aggressive and indiscriminate policy of removing all native tribes from Texas lands. This would culminate in what would come to be known as the Cherokee Wars, in which numerous tribes would combat and ultimately fall to Lamar's radical policies. This would see them moved north into what was known as the Indian Territories, an area comprising the modern-day state of Oklahoma. They would again venture southward with the re-election of Sam Houston in 1841, as Houston had always made it a point to maintain his position as an ardent ally of the tribe. Many Delaware would serve in invaluable capacities as scouts for the Texas Rangers, as well as the U.S. Army, in conflicts ranging throughout Texas in the 19th century. Eventually, however, they would be permanently relegated to reservation lands in Oklahoma, where their official offices still reside today. For his part, Hayes would also go on to see far more action in fights against the Comanche, the Mexican Army, local bandits, even eventually going on to move west with the 1849 gold rush, becoming the first sheriff of San Francisco in 1850 and amassing a considerable land and cattle fortune in Northern California. Hayes would pass away in 1883, at the age of 66, in Piedmont, California. He is buried in the Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California. This story, despite its scope and brutality, is but one of the countless accounts of bravery, vengeance, and violence on the Texas frontier in the 1800s that are too numerous to cover here in one episode. The many tales of the Comanche, the Delaware, the Texas Rangers, and the legendary Jack Hayes are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Corpus Christi, Texas, late spring, 1846. As the burgeoning township bustles with citizens going about their daily commerce and conversation, a man sits alone in a hotel lobby, seemingly unbothered, reading a handwritten note with as much regard as if he were perusing a mildly interesting article from one of the city's local newspapers. The note, however, brings gravely serious news. The dreaded Comanche, the mighty lords of the southern plains who, despite the incessant conflict between Mexico and the newly arrived Anglo settlers, are the true rulers of Texas, have once again been on a trail of wanton death and destruction. Very few times in the history of the Old West had any contending force been able to offer up more than a tacit defense against the highly mobile, highly skilled, and legendarily aggressive horsebound warriors. The man in the hotel lobby knowingly folds the note, places it in his jacket pocket, and moves out the door into the street, bearing the countenance of a man simply striking out on a morning stroll. However, the man's reputation belies his cordial, understated manner. His name is Captain John Coffee Hayes, better known as Captain Jack Hayes, and he is perhaps the most well-known Texas Ranger in the state. The note informs Hayes that a party of 600 Comanche warriors have spent the previous few days raiding settlements southwest of San Antonio. Now Hayes and the 40 Rangers under his command in the town of Corpus Christi make their way to the Medina River, west of the city of San Antonio. From here, they make their way north, to an area known as Bandera Pass. Finding the trail of the Comanche raiding party with the indispensable assistance of their native guides, the Rangers then make their way northwest, past the legendary landmark known as Enchanted Rock. It is concluded amongst the veteran Rangers and native scouts alike that the Comanche are headed west for a small lake located at the base of what is known as Paint Rock, a favorite watering spot for raiding parties. Hayes and his men now agree that taking the most direct route to the watering hole is their only hope of catching the Comanche before they are able to disperse upon the vast open plains of northern Texas. Hayes drives the men until well past midnight, even then allowing only a short rest until daylight. At sunrise, the party again pulls their stiff and sleep-deprived bodies into their saddles for another full day's ride across the undulating, limestone-strewn terrain. Finally, in the early evening, they arrive at the pictograph-strewn rocks that give Paint Rock its all-too-apt moniker, and Hayes and his men come upon the large pond that serves as the noted watering hole. Seeing themselves to have arrived before the Comanche, the Rangers and Scouts hurriedly make their way to a small thicket of willow trees located on the northern end of the pond. The thicket, replete with a thick underbrush, will serve as the Rangers' hiding spot as they wait to ambush the Comanche. As night casts its shadow over the whole of the landscape around them, Hayes posts sentries to keep watch, and orders the rest of the men to sleep as well as they are able. In what must seem like a literal blink of the eye to most of the men, the first rays of sunlight are soon peeking over the eastern horizon. Soon, after the sun begins to rise in earnest, the silhouettes of several dozen Comanche warriors, herding their stolen horses, can be seen making their way towards the pond. The morning is typically muggy, causing a small fog to form around the pond itself. In whispered tones, Hayes instructs his men to wait for his command to fire their initial volley. Though he is a man of medium height and build, possessive of a high-toned voice, and known by all as particularly well-mannered, especially for a crowd as notoriously bellicose and ill-behaved as the Texas Rangers, Hayes knows his orders will be obeyed by his men. Though he cuts a unique figure on the rough and tumble edges of bleeding Texas, Jack Hayes has earned his respect, admiration, and loyalty from this lot of hardscrabble men. The Comanche as well are well aware of Hayes and his Rangers' efforts to stem their tide of raiding. It is well known throughout the whole of Texas that the scalp of any Texas Ranger is highly coveted by the Comanche, and that the scalp of Captain Jack Hayes is perhaps the most sought after in all of what the Spanish of centuries past had termed Comancheria. However vaunted his reputation, though, Hayes, and every man in the thicket, native scout and ranger alike, knows that they are now in a mortally dangerous situation, one in which the element of surprise and maintaining an offensive attack will spell the difference in their surviving the day or suffering a brutal demise at the hands of the Comanche. For an agonizing few minutes, the Comanche, riding in a spread-out, loose formation, make their way towards the watering hole. Finally, when the Comanche are mere yards away, the morning air is cut by the shrill Tennessean accent of Jack Hayes, shouting, "Fire!" The Rangers and Scouts let loose their initial volley from their single-shot rifles, but several of the shots missed their mark in the morning fog. A few of the unsuspecting Comanche are knocked from their horses, most soon lying still in death. Their comrades, unable to rescue them in the fray, retreat to outside of rifle range and wait for the sun to rise fully to illuminate the battlefield. As the ground becomes more and more visible to the Comanche, they discern from the Rangers' tracks that the Texas party is far smaller than their own. They see their odds as favorable and decide to proceed with a head-on assault on the willow thicket. Just as soon as the sun is visible in its totality, Hayes, the veteran Rangers, and Scouts see the Comanche chief don his headdress and exhort his men to bravery and ruthlessness in the coming charge. As the Comanche, still outside of rifle range, marshal their forces into a long, single line, Hayes instructs his men, at the mercy of their single-shot rifles and relatively new revolver pistols, to pick one warrior, take careful aim, and shoot them down. Every shot must count, he reminds them, or they are sure to be overrun. Then, for an all too brief moment, the men in the thicket find themselves near mesmerized by the nearly medieval spectacle before them, one that has struck terror throughout the frontier for nearly 2 centuries. The Comanche are armed with stout, short bows, similar to those used centuries before by Genghis Khan and the Mongols on the vast steppes of the Central Asian plains. Comanche lances, used primarily for spearing running buffalo from behind, measure roughly 14 feet in length and are just as deadly in combat against humans. Comanche shields are notoriously sturdy and often able to deflect bullets when held at the correct angle. Some of the warriors are also armed with rifles acquired from trading and raiding. Hayes and his men are not yet armed with the Walker Colt pistols that will spell a deciding difference in many fights yet to come. Instead, they possess that weapon's predecessor, the Patterson Colt revolver. Chambered in .44 caliber, the revolver possesses a rotating cylinder holding 5 shots. These cylinders must be detached to be reloaded, and thus the Rangers carry several preloaded cylinders. For a few brief moments, some of the Rangers hold the hundreds of advancing warriors in awe. Riding in front of the formation is the chief they had first seen on the horizon. The chief wears a fringed buckskin shirt, adorned with silver ornaments, along with a buffalo headdress complete with a tuft of buffalo hair at the front to hide his face. The warrior carries a large shield and spear and bears the countenance of a man keenly familiar with the perils of combat. At first sight, many among the Rangers feign a reticence to fire upon the advancing Comanche, remarking that they are, quote, too pretty to shoot. However, their hypnotic fascination is soon broken when the warriors break into a headlong charge, heading towards the northeast corner of the thicket. The Rangers again hold their fire until the Comanche are within range, as war whoops and the rumble of galloping horses fill the air. In their classic formation, the Comanche now advance in a cyclone, whirling towards the Rangers in a circular motion, with each warrior loosing their arrow at the moment they are closest to the Ranger position, before continuing their pattern to the back of the formation, only to reload and fire again on their next revolution. The charge continues forward, with hundreds of arrows pouring into the thicket. Then, as suddenly as the charge began, all other sound is momentarily drowned out amid the torrent of gunfire and smoke that fills the air. Dozens of warriors fall to the ground, their riderless horses charging onward towards the Ranger line or following their cohorts back into the fray of the Comanche formation. The Comanche now deviate their path of attack southward, attempting to sweep around the backside of the thicket. This serves to distract the Rangers, as the wounded Comanche now make desperate, pitiable attempts to crawl their way to the cover of the cliffs of painted rock. The second attack is diverted as well, with another round of cacophonous gunfire from the thicket, and the Comanche, momentarily reeling, move back to the cover of the cliffs to regroup and tend to their wounded comrades. For several nerve-wracking minutes, the Texans and native scouts in the thicket can only reload and wait in a tense silence for another imminent Comanche attack. Suddenly, the Comanche war chief again appears on the horizon of the cliffs, followed by hundreds of charging warriors, seemingly more intent on dislodging and killing their quarry than ever before. Again, Hayes reminds the men to make their shots count, and again the Comanche charge the southern edge of the thicket, with Hayes and his men holding their fire until the Comanche are within mere yards of their position. This charge, too, is rebuffed, and the Comanche retreat to the northern end of the lake to again convene and decide on their next course of action. They decide that a lance charge is in order. They will close ranks with the Texans and scouts in the thicket and kill them at close range. Another charge is made, with hundreds of warriors streaming towards the ensconced ranger position. Again, they are driven back by their enemy's precise fire. Now, this gruesome pattern repeats throughout the afternoon, as the Comanche mount charge after charge on the thicket, their fury mounting in equal proportion to their losses. Finally, just before nightfall, the attacks abate, and the Comanche withdraw to outside rifle range, where they camp in plain sight of the scouts and rangers now effectively trapped inside the thicket. Hayes, for his part, posts sentries throughout the night as his men attempt to rest. Their proximity to the lake renders them able to resupply their drinking water and enables them to cut off the Comanche from doing so for themselves. The Comanche, instead, are forced to travel several miles to obtain water safely. Though they are camped outside of the Rangers' rifle range, several attempts are made by warriors throughout the night to sneak onto the battlefield in order to retrieve the bodies of their slain comrades. Several of these warriors, too, are cut down in their attempts by fire from the Ranger sentries. The intermittent gunfire carries on through the night, making sleep a scarce commodity for all. On the second day, as the sun rises, the Comanche attacks again continue, seemingly having lost none of their ferocity and determination from the previous day. For hour after hour, wave after wave of Comanche warriors make attempts at overrunning the entrenched Texan position. They then divide their forces into 4 groups, with each group attacking the thicket from a different direction. Several times, these groups come close to overtaking the Rangers and Scouts and impaling them on the end of their 14-foot lances. For the entirety of the day, the attacks continue, until again the Comanche retreat out of rifle range and make camp. Hayes, again, orders his men to get all the sleep that they can, and every combatant on the field settles in for yet another restless night. After another long night, another Comanche charge comes, this time barely illuminated by the light of dawn. As the third day of the battle commences, Hayes and his men are all too aware that their limited ammunition is becoming ever more limited with every Comanche charge. It is also suspected that the Comanche may have sent runners for reinforcements, painting an even more dire situation for the trapped contingent of Rangers and Scouts. For several hours, again, wave after wave of attacks are made, this time all of them accosting the north side of the thicket. With each successive charge, the Texians, yet to incur any casualties of their own, manage to deplete the Comanche forces of more and more warriors and horses. Soon, the battlefield is a bloody morass of human and equine bodies alike, lying prostrate and still on blood-soaked ground. Finally, late in the morning, the Comanche war chief assembles his men into a line. Though the Rangers and Scouts cannot discern the words being spoken, the tone is one of stern admonition. It is quickly inferred that the Comanche are determined to make one final charge, even at the sure cost of many of their own lives. Within a fleeting few moments, the final charge is at hand, with the Comanche bearing down upon the thicket at full speed, bellowing their war cries with all their might. Again, the Rangers and Scouts hold their fire as the charge advances. This time, Hayes advances in front of the thicket, taking careful aim at the chief leading the charge. As arrows begin to fly in among the thicket, the Ranger captain and chief see the ground between them rapidly closing. For a split second, the chief turns to issue a directive to his warriors. This, however, is the opening Hayes has waited for, as it momentarily exposes the chief's torso from behind his sizable shield. With the retort of Hayes's rifle, the chief falls to the ground, irretrievably caught in the throes of death. His warriors, ever loyal to their cohort and leader, stop to attempt to assist him, and are peppered with gunfire from the thicket. As they mill about the edges of the battlefield, making a series of ill-advised attempts at retrieving their leader's body, one of the Rangers rides swiftly onto the battlefield and, in a macabre scene, ropes the feet of the dead chief and drags his body back into the thicket to be rifled through by the victorious Rangers and Scouts. Though they are greatly disheartened and disgusted, the Comanche have no further desire to sacrifice their warriors and horses in an increasingly futile attempt to kill but a scant few trespassers in their territory. Soon, they disappear to the northwest. For several hours, Hayes orders the men to remain in their positions, in order to ensure that the Comanche retreat was not another tactical feint. Once this is assured, the Rangers and their Scouts are free to go about the grisly business of securing war trophies in the form of loot, weaponry, and scalps. One Ranger has incurred an arrow wound to his forearm in the final charge, and one horse has been killed. In turn, over 100 dead Comanche are counted, with many believing there to be more killed warriors carried off by their comrades. Though the war between Texas and the Comanche will continue on for decades, this will be the last time Captain Jack Hayes engages them on the battlefield in Texas. For his part, Hayes will go on to command the Rangers in the coming Mexican-American War, before making his way to California during the Gold Rush. But the countless tales of violence, vengeance, ruthlessness, and courage in the history of Texas are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Fort Colorado, Texas, late March 1837. As a full moon illuminates the hill country and prairie lands that surround them, a small contingent of Texas Rangers while away the cool spring evening ensconced in conversation, card games, and the whine of the fiddle being played by Ranger Noah Smithwick. The more senior veterans of this ad hoc frontier force regaled their younger comrades with stories of past fights with, and narrow escapes from, the fearsome, venerable Comanche. The Rangers' very existence and their presence at this fort located in what is now southeast Austin is the product of Texas's ongoing fight against the ruling lords of the Southern Plains. The Comanche have spent the previous century clearing nearly the whole of Texas of any peoples who sought to oppose their claim to these valuable lands. It had first been the Apache, then the Spanish, then the Mexicans, who had suffered the brunt of Comanche raiding and warfare. Innumerable times, in just the preceding few years, entire families had been laid waste. The men killed outright were subjected to vicious torture killings. The women and children taken prisoner and oftentimes either killed themselves or subjugated to a life of slavery. The Comanche, once a downtrodden people, relegated to the hinterlands of the northern Rockies, had risen to prominence with the acquisition of the horse in the 17th century. Though many tribes had been the beneficiaries of the diaspora of horses onto the open plains following the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, it was the Comanche in particular who had taken to the animal with a seemingly intrinsic, inexplicable ease. Their penchant for horsemanship and capabilities as a mounted raiding and warfare machine had rapidly become the stuff of gruesome folklore across all of Texas. And for generations now, military forces, including the likes of the Spanish and Mexican army, had tried and failed to stem the tide of Comanche violence. The Texas Rangers had been officially formed in 1823 by Stephen F. Austin, eventual namesake to the now capital city, in hopes that the ranging companies could provide both a territorial patrol and a sort of quick reaction force to respond to raiding in the area. In the ensuing 14 years, the Rangers have met with varying degrees of success and faced numerous setbacks and challenges in regards to both manning and arming their forces. At this point in 1837, just after the Texas Revolution, the entirety of the Texas frontier comprises the very bleeding edge of westward expansion from America. The pay for a prospective ranger is low, and the likelihood of a grisly demise at the hands of his enemy is comparatively high. They are armed with single-shot rifles and pistols against an enemy capable of unleashing several arrows a minute from a rapidly oncoming cavalry charge. Still, though they have at times seen casualty rates as high as 50%, the Rangers have proven thus far to be the only consistent, even marginally effective force against the Comanche. Still, these men inside Fort Colorado largely count themselves fortunate to have found such a vigorous, violent profession. However, on this night, most of them have resigned themselves to a restful, placid evening. But just as some of the men are about to turn in for the night, one of the Rangers on guard duty spots the flickering light of a campfire a few miles west up the Colorado River, on a high knoll overlooking a popular crossing spot near today's Lamar Boulevard. This is, to say the least, an unusual sighting. In such hostile territory, travelers of any kind, be they native, Texan, American, or Mexican, generally avoided illuminating their positions with campfires. Doing so was, oftentimes, inviting an ambush from the dreaded Comanche. However, as the ranger studies the spectacle longer, he begins to see shadowy figures, dancing back and forth in the flicker of the light. He reports his findings, and many among the men concur that the only party of warriors who would be so bold as to strike a campfire in the middle of Comanche territory would be the Comanche themselves. Even from afar, it is clear that this band of warriors is unconcerned with their own safety, believing themselves to be all but untouchable inside the confines of their rightful domain. Now, the conversation amongst the Rangers shifts to whether or not an immediate attack should be made. The officer in charge, a veteran ranger by the name of Captain Andrews, confers with some of the other veterans, all of whom argue for advancing upon the Comanche immediately. Charged with the safety and well-being of his men, however, Captain Andrews is momentarily reluctant to order his men outside the walls of the fort, considering the risk of a night movement and surprise attack on an enemy force of unknown strength. His veteran rangers, however, offer a simple and straightforward solution to this quandary by insisting that Captain Andrews need only ask for volunteers. Seeing this as a suitable compromise, Captain Andrews asks for volunteers and is roundly met with several rangers ready to depart at once. These men double-check their weapons, load themselves with as much lead shot and gunpowder as they can carry, and mount their trusted war horses before riding out of the gates and into the dark of the hill country night. Leading the volunteers is Second Lieutenant Wren, another veteran ranger. In total, there are 15 rangers now making their way through this precarious country under the cover of night. Adding to the ominous affair of this occasion, storm clouds soon roll in, further darkening the night sky. As they near the site of the Comanche camp, Lieutenant Wren, Ranger Joe Weeks, and Ranger Noah Smithwick advance ahead of the rest of the ranger contingent to reconnoiter the area ahead. This task, simple enough on its face, becomes an hours-long endeavor that consumes the remainder of the night, as the rangers literally inch forward on their bellies through the brush and tall grass towards the Comanche camp. Finally, as the sun begins to crest the eastern horizon, the rangers find themselves in plain view of the Comanche camp. However, their trajectory has placed them far closer to the Comanche's horse herd than they had initially planned. For a tense few moments, the rangers hold their collective breath, as it seems all but certain that the remuda of Comanche horses and mules will be spooked by their presence, inevitably alerting their owners. But, miraculously, the animals continue grazing, seemingly unfazed by the Rangers' presence. Scanning the campsite, the Rangers are astonished to see sleeping Comanches strewn out upon the ground, seemingly sleeping off a long night of revelry. Now, having remained undetected and having avoided potential calamity, Wren, Weeks, and Smithwick make a much more hastened crawl backwards, rejoining their comrades and reporting their findings. Here, they hurriedly lay out a plan for the attack. The Rangers will divide their forces and sweep down upon the Comanche camp from 2 directions. Second Lieutenant Wren will lead the smaller contingent to the right of the cluster of cedar trees which holds the Comanche camp, while Noah Smithwick will lead the second, larger contingent which will attack the camp head-on. With the morning sun now rapidly on the rise, the Rangers hasten forth to make their attack. As the surrounding birds begin to chirp, Smithwick moves his men into position, and then notices that, in the dimly lit morning hue, Wren has taken his party past the intended target, having mistaken which cluster of cedar trees to attack. With no means to communicate with his commanding officer, Smithwick knows that the only course of action is to carry forward with the assault. Moments after Smithwick realizes Wren's mistake, the first of the Comanche warriors begins to stir awake, only yards away from Smithwick and his men. Still in a haze, the warrior sleepily pulls himself into a sitting position and begins to sing his personal song, a long-standing Comanche tradition, as a greeting to the morning sun. However, the man singing has alerted Wren to his mistake, and he now leads his contingent hurriedly towards the sound of the singing Comanche. The Comanche warrior, now alerted by the sounds of Wren and his Rangers running towards him through the brush, jumps to his feet and attempts to run back to his cohorts in the camp. He sprints forward, crying out to his comrades that an attack is underway. However, he has scarcely gone but a few yards when a lead ball from Ranger Joe Weeks' rifle tears into his back, sending him tumbling to the ground, dead. Now, the Comanche are fully alerted, and the camp springs to life, with warriors attempting to arm themselves while making a retreat to a nearby ravine. Wren and Smithwick's forces now make a charge on the Comanche camp from their planned sides, unleashing a cacophonous volley into the scrambling warriors, hoping to kill any and all that they can before they are able to arm themselves. Most of the Comanche, however, are able to make their way to the nearby ravine. From here, they begin to mount a counterattack of their own, pouring arrows and bullets in amongst the Rangers. A vicious battle ensues, with the Rangers taking cover and making repeated charges upon the Comanche in the ravine. On one of these charges, a Comanche bullet strikes the young Private Philip Martin in the head, killing him instantly. The Rangers, incensed at having incurred the loss of the much-liked young man, redoubled their efforts to finish off the Comanche in the ravine. The fight continues on, but soon the Comanche are able to slip away from the ravine and disappear into the cedar breaks. They have left their horse herd and most of their belongings, much of which are plundered and claimed by the Rangers as spoils of their efforts. A thorough post-action examination of the battlefield is also made, in an effort to discern the damage inflicted upon the Comanche. As far as either Wren or Smithwick could tell, the first Comanche warrior to awake and be fired upon had surely died where he had fallen. In his recollection, Smithwick recalls specifically that, in his charge towards the camp, he had stepped over the body of the warrior lying lifeless on the ground. But, after the battle, the warrior's body is nowhere to be found. The body of Philip Martin is lashed to his horse, and the party somberly make their way eastward, back down the Colorado River and into the confines of the fort. Here, Philip Martin is laid to rest with honors, alongside the body of a private who had been killed months earlier by an accidental rifle discharge. The Rangers will go on to refine their techniques and tactics in combating the Comanche, and the Comanche, for decades to come, will assert their dominance over the whole of central and northern Texas via endless, vicious warfare and raiding. In the annals of their conflict's history, this conflict, however minor, is indicative of the all-too-common succession of events that would occur countless times across the Texas frontier, one in which the martial spirit that drove the very survival of the Rangers resulted in the loss of one of their own, for what was ultimately an unverifiable and inconsequential toll exacted upon their enemy. Many of the men at the fort will, however, go on to fulfill and even extend their enlistments with the Rangers, continuing on to legendary careers on the violent expanses of the Texas frontier, as well as in the brutal fighting of the Mexican-American War. Noah Smithwick would go on to pen an autobiography, link in the description, that is regarded as one of the most comprehensive accounts of early Ranger life left by one of their own. It is replete with tales of conflict, camaraderie, violence, and vengeance, and is an invaluable resource for anyone interested in further reading on this fascinating, often overlooked era of history. But the many tales of Noah Smithwick, as well as his fellow Rangers and the mighty, fearsome Comanche warriors with whom they fought, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. January 18th, 1837. 18-year-old Abram Anglin rides towards the Trinity River with a group of close friends and fellow Texas Rangers. Though he is scarcely into his late teens, the young man finds himself deeply fatigued. Only months earlier, he had been amongst a small number of survivors of the devastating raid on Parker's Fort, in which the universally feared Comanche had brutally killed several settlers and carried off several of their children. The raid would make national headlines and go on to be remembered as one of the most seminal and most violent moments in Texas history. Several of the male inhabitants of the fort, Samuel Frost, Robert Frost, John Parker, Benjamin Parker, and Silas Parker, were killed. Anglin was amongst those who managed to escape and has since settled in Fort Houston, near the present-day town of Palestine, Texas. In the short time since the incident, Anglin has struggled with traumatizing memories and an accompanying lack of restful sleep. Though the scene Anglin and his cohorts witnessed and survived was certainly stultifying in its brutality and callousness, it was not unique on the Texas frontier. Though the tales of the raid on Parker's Fort would quickly become the stuff of national folklore, the raid, and raids like it that were now besieging the newly immigrated Texans, was nothing new. For decades now, the native peoples who had long held dominion over northern, central, and western Texas had been experiencing similar raids, with many, like the Apache, Waco, and Tonkawa, being driven from their lands by the incessant raiding of their long-hated enemies in the Comanche. Even the government of Mexico had grown so tired of the raiding upon their northerly settlements that they had agreed to allow Anglo settlers into the area, on the condition of their conversion to Catholicism, in order to act as a human buffer between Mexican settlements and the Comanche. Still, despite being all too aware of the danger involved, Abram Anglin has refused to recoil from further confrontation with the Comanche, enlisting with the relatively new Ranger regiments which patrol the Texas frontier under the auspices of curtailing the incessant violence and thievery from both Comanche raiding parties and outlaw bandits. Now, he and his fellow Rangers have been dispatched from Fort Sam Houston on an official mission. The young Rangers, David Falconberry, Evan Falconberry, Benjamin W. Duthit, James Hunter, and Columbus Anderson, now make their way through dangerous, hostile territory to the banks of the Trinity River, searching for the quarry that they have been dispatched to hunt down, a pack of local hogs who have wandered away from the fort and now have been missing for several days. The men are tasked with retrieving the errant animals, preferably alive, and returning them to the fort. Upon arriving, they scour the river bottom, and soon find a number of the wayward swine. James Hunter and Benjamin Duthit volunteer to return the animals to the fort, while their comrades continue the search. They assure the men that they leave behind that when they return the next day, they will be sure to bring one of the fort's canoes back with them, so that the party might cross to the western side of the Trinity River to continue their search. The Rangers who remain, Anglin, the Falconberry brothers, and Columbus Anderson, continue their search on the eastern banks for a number of hours, before finally becoming so collectively bored that they decide to construct a makeshift raft in order to cross the Trinity. The men cross the river at a point which will later come to be the small settlement of Bonner's Ferry, and continue on their search, this time staying together in a group for the sake of safety and communication. They spend another few hours searching, this time finding no pigs. Now fatigued and chilled to the bone from the incessant Texas north wind, the men decide to make their way to an overhang they had spotted upon first coming to the shore, in order to rest and warm themselves as best they can. While making their way to the overhang, however, the men are met with a disconcerting discovery. Embedded in the muddy banks of the river are several sets of moccasin-clad footprints. However, being cold, tired, hungry, and relatively sure that these were in fact tracks of the friendly Cherokee who also frequented this crossing, the men decided to carry on to the shelter of the rocky embankment. Arriving thoroughly exhausted from their efforts in the biting cold, the men stretch themselves out on the ground and are soon fast asleep. Within minutes of the last ranger drifting off into slumber, however, every man among them is awakened by piercing war cries to a blood-curdling sight. Bearing down upon them, and now scarcely 15 feet away from the overhang, are roughly 30 Comanche warriors, incensed at their presence and intent on killing them all. Before the rangers can fire upon them with their single-shot rifles, the Comanche let loose with a volley of their own, filling the air with bullets and arrows. David Falconberry is hit by a bullet in the initial volley and mortally wounded. Columbus Anderson is also hit twice, struck with 2 arrows in his neck. Still, with adrenaline coursing through his veins, David Falconberry cries out, "Come on, boys, it's time to go." Falconberry and Anderson, both bleeding profusely, dive into the Trinity River, leaving grisly red streaks in the water as they swim to the opposite shore. Abram Anglin has been wounded in the thigh, with a bullet having passed through his powder horn and causing shards of the implement to embed themselves in his thigh. Evan Falconberry has escaped serious injury in the first volley, but instead of diving into the river himself, has taken cover behind a cluster of trees near the embankment. Now, he finds himself cut off from the river by the attacking Comanche. Seeing that he can be of no further immediate use to his comrade, Abram Anglin now dives into the river himself, with arrows and bullets striking the water all around him as he swims. Finally, after what feels like an eternity, Anglin finds himself on the eastern bank, opposite the attacking Comanche. Here, he finds David Falconberry, collapsed and bleeding profusely. Falconberry tells the teenage Anglin to escape if he can, and to hurry back with relief. This relief will not come, however, as David Falconberry is soon dead. Anglin now sprints as fast as he can, running roughly 400 yards before meeting James Hunter, one of the rangers who had gone back to the fort earlier that day. Hunter pulls Anglin onto the back of his horse, and the pair make a mad dash to return to the fort as the Comanches cross the river in pursuit. Anglin only breathes a sigh of relief when they are finally ensconced within the relative safety of the fort. With his nervous system rattled to a near breaking point, the young ranger finally falls into a deep sleep inside the confines of one of the fort's rooms. Though his day is done, the grisly work of the rest of the rangers at Fort Houston carries on in the afternoon and evening. One ranger, Captain Haggard, now sends out a rescue party in hopes of finding any survivors. After the short ride from the fort to the Trinity River, the rescue party is greeted by an unsettlingly violent scene. Discovered first is the body of David Falconberry, who had urged Abram Anglin to leave him and go for help. Falconberry had apparently constructed a bed of grass and was found lying prone on it, only feet away from a small pool of water near the river. Next, the party finds the body of Columbus Anderson. Also lying prone, the ranger had managed to cover an astonishing 2 miles upstream after swimming across the Trinity River, all while bleeding profusely and with 2 Comanche arrows embedded in his neck. The rescue party then crosses the river and spends a considerable amount of time searching for any sign of Evan Falconberry. Much to their dismay, however, Evan Falconberry is never found nor heard from again. Though the rangers go to the extent of sounding the stream in search of his body, finding nothing, a Comanche account of the incident soon circulates the area, possibly shedding light on the missing ranger's ultimate fate. The account from the Comanche holds that Evan Falconberry had fired upon them and then put up a brutal, dogged resistance, fighting the Comanche tooth and nail, killing 2 warriors and wounding a third as they hacked, stabbed, and shot at him from all directions. Finally, mortally wounded and deciding not to leave his body to be mutilated by the Comanche, Falconberry had sprinted to the river, dove in, swam to the middle, and, amidst a swirl of blood, sank to the bottom, never to be seen again. In the brutal reality of the Texas frontier, this attack was nothing unique in its ferocity and inhumanity. The late 1830s would prove to be only the beginning of a decades-long war between the Comanches and the Texas Rangers. Both sides would find themselves victims and perpetrators alike of countless heinous acts, begotten by a seemingly perpetual cycle of violence in the conflict for ownership of Texas. For his part, Abram Anglin would go on to join another ranger company only weeks later in March of 1837, where he would serve for several more years. He would eventually marry and move to the town of Groesbeck, Texas, where he would pass away at the age of 58. At Fort Houston, reprimands were made by no less than the fort's namesake himself, President of Texas Sam Houston. Houston insisted that the attacks could have been wholly avoided had his instructions to construct a brick-and-mortar lodging on each side of the river and to establish an official ferry site at the crossing been followed. The official dispatch, reprimanding the official commander of the fort in one Major Jewell, reads as follows. The first orders for the erection of a blockhouse and a ferry boat on the Trinity River were issued 5 months since, and a part of this time more than 100 men might have been employed for that purpose. The care advised by the President has been utterly disregarded, and owing to that alone is to be attributed the present melancholy accounts. You will perceive the necessity of preserving the most sleepless vigilance, and keep out guards under all circumstances, and never allow your enemy the slightest opportunity to catch you off guard. In the coming years, Texas would experience waves of violence that seldom had been seen in even the most conflict-ridden areas of the eastern United States. The ruthless combat on display at the Trinity River on this winter day in 1837 is but one example of countless encounters that would take place in the years to come. But the stories of those battles, shootouts, and in some cases, outright massacres are, for tonight, other stories for other times. May 29th, 1850, 8 miles northwest of present-day Alice, Texas. Captain John Rip Ford and his contingent of Texas Rangers are making their way down a tributary of the Nueces River. They were on their way south, toward their headquarters at San Antonio Viejo, or Old San Antonio, near the U.S.-Mexico border on the Rio Grande. Captain Ford, known as Rip, which many apocryphal accounts attribute to his signing of so many death notices while serving as a quartermaster in the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848, has just celebrated his 35th birthday. He is joined by several other veterans of the war, all of whom are in their 20s and early 30s. Second in command is Lieutenant Andrew Jackson Walker. Malchiah Benjamin Highsmith serves as quartermaster and commissary. David Level serves as orderly, and Philip N. Luckett serves as the surgeon. Though young, all have considerable combat experience in the brutal conflicts of the Mexican-American War. A number of other Rangers rounded out their ranks, including William Gillespie. Gillespie, a relatively new Ranger, had also served in the Mexican-American War and came from a family who held a revered and respected place in the Ranger history. His uncle, Robert Gillespie, had served with distinction along with Ranger legends such as Jack Hayes, Bigfoot Wallace, Samuel Walker, and Rip Ford himself. Robert Addison Gillespie, known as Addie to his friends, had served with distinction in countless campaigns against the Comanche. He had met his end 4 years earlier while serving in the Mexican-American War. On September 22, 1846, in the Battle of Monterey, the elder Gillespie had reportedly been the first Ranger to breach the perimeter of the fort on Independence Hill. During the action, he was shot in the torso and mortally wounded. He would succumb to his wound a day later, on September 23rd. William Gillespie, determined to follow in his legendary uncle's footsteps, was keen to engage the Comanche and solidify his own reputation with the Rangers. The Rangers' lead scout is a half-Comanche, half-Mexican man named Rocco Magricio, who spoke 3 languages, Spanish, English, and Comanche, and was thoroughly familiar with the territory they were in, near the Nueces River. He was also reputed to have an otherworldly sense of smell. Despite the highly desirable skill set of their scout, they had spent much of the previous fall in pursuing specter-like bands of Comanche in vain, all throughout South Texas. They had, in fact, not even seen any Comanche in many months. This had been a source of great frustration for Ford, certainly, but even more so for the young and battle-hungry amongst them, like William Gillespie. During this spring, though, combat with the Comanche had seemed a more and more certain prospect. Their first contact would come as a shock, though, when they were startled awake on May 26th by the gunshot of a Ranger posted as sentry. His intended target had been a group of shadowy figures astride several of the Rangers' horses, riding away from the herd at a full gallop. After the riders did not halt at the sentry's orders, the ranger opened fire, hitting one unfortunate rider in the torso and knocking him to the ground. Until the sun broke on the eastern horizon, no ranger left the perimeter of the camp for fear of being caught in an ambush in the dark. However, once dawn broke, the group was sent out to retrieve the unidentified would-be horse thief. They returned to camp soon after, bearing with them the barely alive body of a teenage Comanche warrior. He had been part of a group of young warriors intent on stealing the Texans' horses, garnering themselves a measure of material wealth and social renown. Though his cohorts had managed to escape, this unfortunate young man had been mortally wounded by the sentry's shot. As he expired, the rangers rode out of camp and reconnoitered an area several miles in circumference, finding none of the unfortunate young warrior's companions. Later that day, Captain Ford scribbled a note detailing their location and contact with the Comanches and requesting reinforcements. He dispatched another eventual ranger legend, Edward Burleson Jr., to carry the message to the nearby Fort Merrill. Burleson departed and later returned that afternoon, reporting of a dismal, even downright disturbing state of affairs at the fort. The commander, J.B. Plummer, seemed not only unconcerned with the potential danger, but also upset with the Rangers for their early morning gunshots disturbing his troopers' sleep. Plummer dismissed the reports of Comanche being so close to the fort, despite the tangible proof of a dying prisoner in the custody of the Rangers. His reticent agreement to send a small detachment of his regulars back to the Ranger camp with Burleson only resulted in the already bizarre situation deteriorating into the macabre. That night, one of the regulars wandered about the camp, toting the head of the recently deceased Comanche as a trophy. Even for the veteran Rangers, and especially for their neophyte brethren, such a sight was both disgusting and distasteful. Ford described the man as loony and sent the regulars away upon being made aware of the reprehensible display. Now, 3 days later, as they made their way south, their eyes always scanning the brush and horizon for potential dangers, many among them desired only to exit this territory and secure a few days' respite within the walls of San Antonio Viejo. Once ensconced within the comparative safety of sturdy, cool adobe walls, and tempering their nerves with a stiff drink, perhaps their minds could unwind enough to process the events of the preceding 72 hours. But San Antonio Viejo was still a long ride up the Nueces from here, and whether the Rangers knew it or not, there would be no respite from violence and danger anywhere in their near future. For, though the Texas frontier was a vast expanse of territory that did not always lend itself to ease in travel nor communication, word did spread fast, and word had spread to the Comanche via the survivors of the failed raid on the Ranger encampment that the Texians had inflicted a hard death on one of their beloved tribesmen. Though the Comanche could be harsh, unremitting, and even overtly inhumane to even the most innocent of their enemy, Comanche families and bands were incredibly close and unyieldingly sentimental. As was common amongst many Plains tribes, the Comanche ceremonial grieving process often involved self-mortification that could at times even result in the death of the practitioner. The Comanche, though, perhaps more than any tribe, managed to perpetually strike a Newtonian balance in avenging wrongs done to them. That is to say, to whatever degree they perceived themselves to have been aggrieved, it was their right, nigh their karmic duty, to seek vengeance via an equal and opposite degree of violence. The Rangers were all too aware of the Comanche's propensity for combat, and thus a tense anticipation pervaded their ranks as they rode south. For better or for worse, though, they would not have to suffer the pangs of dread long. They had broke camp at dawn, and by mid-morning, their scout, Roquet, had spotted the tracks of several unshod horses, sign of a war party being nearby. The Comanche would have been aware of the party's likely destination, as it was the only fort on the Nueces between their current location and the fort they had just left. Thus, Ford and his Rangers assumed, correctly as it would turn out, that the Comanche intended to cut off their current path of travel. With the Comanche, and thereby mortal danger, near at hand, thoughts of relaxing in a border cantina or reposing in a warm bed at their destination were quickly replaced with the immediate demands of combat. Their first engagement saw them being fired upon by a small party of Comanche attackers, another small group of younger braves out reconnoitering the territory. The attackers were quickly disconcerted by the firepower of the Ranger contingent. By 1850, the Rangers, though only a decade and a half old, had already contributed significantly to advancements in firearm technology. The intervening time had seen the average Ranger outfitted at first with single-shot pistols, then 5-shot Patterson Colt revolvers with removable cylinders, to, at this time, the most recent iteration of the Colt revolver, the 1847 Walker Colt. Its predecessor, the Patterson Colt, had been the brainchild of a young New Jersey inventor named Samuel Colt. Colt had first designed the pistol with its revolving cylinder in 1836. Though the implementation of a revolving cylinder was not invented by Samuel Colt, his hope was to bring the concept to its fullest fruition. Though at first it seemed there was no commercial interest in his invention, it would be the burgeoning Republic of Texas who would be an early purchaser of the firearm. In 1839, the Republic would officially purchase 180 of the revolvers for use by, of all things, the Texas Navy. At the time, pirates did frequent the coast of Texas, and the Republic needed to defend itself against possible international incursions now that it was, for the time being, operating as an autonomous entity. However, Governor Sam Houston would disband them in 1843, freeing up the stocks of now unused revolvers for Texas's newest military experiment, the Texas Rangers. The Rangers, who traced their lineage to Stephen F. Austin's ranging companies of the 1830s, were a motley assemblage of combative and adventurous young men whom Texas sought to employ as a light-mounted cavalry. In the intervening years, both the Rangers and the revolver would be put through the refiner's fire of hard, frequent, and highly mobile combat engagements with adversaries ranging from cattle thieves to Mexican soldiers to Comanche warriors. Colt even struck up a correspondence, and eventual friendship, with Ranger Samuel Walker, in which the Ranger related suggestions for improvements and letters oftentimes written not far from the front lines. Walker was a Maryland native who had come to Texas in 1842 via the port at Galveston. He had served under Captain Jesse Billingsley in an ill-fated invasion into Mexico, only to be captured, held as a POW, and narrowly survive what is known to history as the Black Bean Incident, linked to episode in description. Upon returning to Texas, Walker enlisted with the Rangers, and via his experiences in fighting the Comanche, Kiowa, Apache, and in the Mexican-American War, he would come to suggest adding a fixed trigger guard, interchangeable parts for easier repair in the field, and, perhaps most distinctively, adding one chamber to the cylinder, making it a 6-shot revolver. The finished product, what would come to be known as the Colt Walker revolver, would weigh in at 4.5 pounds, with a length of nearly 1.25 feet, firing a .44 caliber ball with an effective range of roughly 100 yards. This made the Colt Walker what amounted to a handheld cannon, especially by the standards of the time. Rip Ford himself, who served with Samuel Walker throughout many of the same campaigns, including the Battle of Veracruz, remarks that the pistol was indeed more powerful than the .54 caliber Mississippi rifle after seeing its lethality at distance in combat. The Rangers quickly adopted the new revolvers in 1847, and Walker himself would carry 2 into combat late that year at the Battle of Huamatla. It would be here on October 9, 1847, that the young Ranger captain would be shot and killed by a sniper. Though Walker had fallen, his legacy, and the legacy of the firearm he had helped to build, were still keenly felt just over 2 years later here on the Nueces River. Rip Ford and the countless other veterans of the war in which Walker perished no doubt felt an extra measure of gratitude for his efforts now that they found themselves surrounded and far from home. The Walker Colt enabled them to lay down a field and rate of fire that could overwhelm the rate of fire that the Comanche were capable of with their short, high-draw-weight bows. The Comanche had long dominated the battlefield in terms of rate of fire and maneuverability, 2 key factors in any engagement. The horsemanship of the average Comanche warrior enabled him to fire his weapon while hanging off the side of the horse, protected from counterfire by the animal's body. He could loose his arrow from over the horse's back, as well as under or over the horse's neck. all while shielding himself from consequential counterattack. These skills were not inherent in the Comanche more than any other people. The difference lay in their lifestyle and training. The Comanche were highly practiced from very young ages at skill sets that would eventually stack together to present the fully formed, fully grown warrior that ruled the southern plains. Comanche children, boys and girls, were taught to ride and to shoot. Common practice drills involved picking up objects off the ground while riding their horses at progressively faster speeds upon every attempt, as well as shooting live birds out of the air with blunted arrows as a means of target practice. But the Rangers, for all their reputation as an ad hoc assemblage of killers for hire, were in fact disciplined, drilled professionals who were not only superb horsemen, but incredibly accurate marksmen while mounted, as well as sound, small group tacticians. And the Rangers were not only well armed, but mounted on some of the finest horses in Texas. A prospective Ranger was not allowed to join the ranks with a horse valued at less than $100. Adjusted for inflation, this would be a cost of roughly $3,900 today. The Rangers were indeed known for their decided lack of military discipline, dress, and decorum. They were free to wear what pleased them, from wide-brimmed hats and serapes to buckskin leggings and coonskin caps. But in combat, they were highly disciplined, highly mobile, and highly dangerous. In 1850, they were essentially the only military force capable of engaging the Comanche on the Comanche's level. On this day, though, that premise would be certainly put to the test. After their initial skirmish near what was known as Rancho Amagosa, Ford ordered his men into skirmish lines spaced out a few yards apart, and the contingent carried on, Colt Walker revolvers drawn and ready. They moved as quietly as possible, communicating via either hand signs or in the most hushed of tones. They would travel another 4 miles up the Nueces before coming in sight of the Comanche's camp, near what is known as Agua Dulce Creek. The Comanche that had attacked them earlier had disappeared to the north, and had evidently not yet returned to their camp to sound the alarm that the Rangers were on their way. This delay meant the Rangers possessed the element of surprise, and Rip Ford sought to use that advantage to its fullest extent immediately. With Ford leading the charge, the Rangers rode full speed towards the unsuspecting war party's camp. The Comanche in camp, soon sensing the oncoming commotion of hoofbeats and riders' exhortations, snatched up their weapons and made a mad dash for their horses. Seconds later, the Rangers would smash into the Comanche camp at full force. Now riding at top speed and loosing howling war cries of their own, the Rangers barreled in amongst the Comanche, shooting down any and all that they could at first sight. No exception was made for the mounts of the Comanche either, as several of them were shot down at point-blank range in order to bring their rider to the ground. Over the course of the next few minutes, a brutal close-quarters combat would unfold throughout the camp, with some warriors standing to fight and others attempting to escape into the mesquite brush that surrounded them. Those who stood and fought were almost all shot down where they stood, while those who retreated into the brush were pursued by mounted Rangers intent on killing them. When the dust had settled, Rip Ford's Rangers had killed 4 of the Comanche warriors in the camp, and, by Ford's account, wounded up to 7. In the immediate aftermath, many of the Rangers were flush with the thrill of victory, and shouts of triumph and congratulations abounded. Then, they heard the screams. In all the commotion, despite what any of them would consider a resounding victory, one of their own had been gravely wounded. Young William Gillespie had been riding through the village on the attack, bringing up the rear as a younger ranger. Ahead of him, he saw a Comanche warrior attempting to flee the village on horseback. The warrior was, however, brought down in quick succession by a shot to the neck and an additional shot to the back. Gillespie watched the warrior fall from his horse, presuming him to be dead as he rode past. But, though mortally wounded, the warrior was not dead. The warrior had managed to bring himself up to a sitting position after Gillespie had ridden by him. Seeing this, Gillespie wheeled his horse around in an effort to shoot the fallen Comanche with his revolver. However, the animal lurched and caused the young man to misfire into the ground between himself and the Comanche. This momentary mishap created all the time the Comanche warrior needed to draw his bow one final time, and, before expiring of his own wounds, loose an arrow that struck Gillespie under the ribcage, piercing his lung. Mortally wounded, the ranger slumped in the saddle. Seeing this, Captain Ford called his rangers off the pursuit of the fleeing Comanche and into 2 squads. One squad formed a defensive line to shield the second, who ushered Gillespie, still slumped in his saddle, to safety. For a tense moment, the fleeing Comanche turned and seemed to ponder an attack on the now compromised rangers, who had just done them so much harm and killed 4 of their own. However, they were not afforded much time in contemplation, as the ranger squad holding the defensive position soon burst into a headlong attack towards them. The Comanche fled into the mesquite, leaving their wounded to the mercy of the rangers. Once outside the effective range of the rangers' firearms, though, the remaining Comanche would continue to taunt and torment the rangers from afar, shielded from sight by the brush and darkness. Meanwhile, the rangers had commandeered what was the Comanche camp only a short time earlier, and turned it into the closest approximation to a field hospital as they were able. Their efforts would do little good, though. Gillespie's wound was severe, with the arrow penetrating deep into his ribcage. In the succeeding hours, he would die a slow, agonizing death. Gillespie was much beloved amongst his cohorts, and the fact that his legendary uncle had suffered such a similar, terrifying fate only a few short years before was not lost on any of the rangers present. But their work was not done. Those not tending to Gillespie were sent out to inspect and treat the horses, many of whom had been injured in the fight. Others were sent out to scout the perimeter of the camp, on the lookout for any lingering Comanche. These rangers returned soon after with a young Comanche who had been injured in the fight and hidden in the brush. The boy had been hit twice by gunshots in the arm, but, much to the rangers' surprise and admiration, remained silent and stoic since being discovered. The boy apparently assumed that he would be taken to the rangers' chief and summarily executed. When he was informed that he would in fact not be harmed, he remained dubious but peaceable. The young man informed the rangers that he was the son of a war chief and that his people had bestowed upon him the rather unfortunate moniker of carne muerto, or dead meat. Were it not for the present circumstances, the bizarre nature of this scenario might have provided some much-needed levity. But as the mortally wounded William Gillespie writhed in pain only a few yards away, there was no laughter to be had. The rangers made camp and endured a restless, agonizing night, one that their friend and compatriot Gillespie would not survive. Some time before the sun rose, the young ranger, who had dreamed of serving proudly and solidifying his own legend, passed away. Captain Ford, who no doubt bore a considerable amount of grief and guilt, having long known the Gillespie family, ordered the young man's body tied to a mule. The rangers then made their way to the top of a small hill near Agua Dulce Creek, where a grave was dug, and Gillespie was wrapped in a blanket, still wearing his boots, still with his hat on. What Ford himself described as a sad but simple service was held, with prayers offered and scriptures read. All the while, the young Comanche captive, who had been brought along in tow, stared silently at the open grave that had been dug. Like most Comanche, he would have been all too aware that the rangers had a reputation for exacting harsh revenge of their own on their prisoners, and he believed that, after the death of their comrade, the rangers now meant to kill him in retribution and bury him in the grave. He was, however, informed that this would not be the case. Gillespie's body was then lowered as gently as possible into the grave, covered with rocks to dissuade the wolves and coyotes, and then the rangers moved on, heading again towards San Antonio Viejo, with one less ranger and one more prisoner in tow. They would indeed make it to San Antonio Viejo. But the story of the rangers fighting the mighty Comanche here in the unforgiving Texas frontier was far from over. Rip Ford and many of the men present that day would go on to legendary careers with the rangers. Though the fate of Carne Muerte, the young Comanche brave taken prisoner, is lost to history, the fate of Comanches was far from determined. Their reign as lords of the southern plains would continue on for at least a quarter century more, as would the tales of horrific raids, merciless battles, and the ongoing fight to hold on to the territory they believed to be rightfully theirs. But those like the countless other stories from the Old West, are other stories for other times. San Antonio, Texas, summer 1841. In the faint light of dawn, a group of 35 horsemen, composed of 20 Mexican citizens and 15 Texas Rangers, are saddling their horses and checking their weapons. The men are angry, indignant, and thirsting for vengeance. Throughout the previous spring, they have lost countless head of cattle and horses, seen their homes ransacked and burned, and, in some cases, seen their loved ones cut down in front of their eyes. Despite the tenuous relationship between Texas and Mexico at the time, this group has followed the age-old adage that the enemy of one's enemy is one's friend. These Anglo-Texans and native-born Mexicans, along with their Lipan Apache native guides, ride now as brothers in arms against their collective enemy, the Comanche. They now unify around the singular intent of their joint mission, retaking the horses that had been most recently stolen from ranches all around San Antonio, as well as killing or capturing any and all Comanche that they can. The group assembles and rides out of town, heading southwest in the direction the Comanche raiders have last been seen. The Rangers, though comprising the minority of the overall force, are the most experienced in tracking and fighting the Comanche, and are assigned to lead this retributive expedition. Though they themselves have only existed for a little over half of a decade, they have amassed considerable combat time against the Comanche. They, along with their native guides, had been amongst the incredibly rare few who had fought the Comanche in their own proverbial backyard with any measure of success. Even then, they had not been able to stem the tide of violence that was washing over the whole of central Texas by way of incessant, horrific Comanche raiding. The intensity and severity of these attacks were unlike anything anyone in Texas, from the native tribes like the Tonkawa, Karankawa, Waco, and Apache, to the Spanish, to the Mexicans, to the Texians, had ever seen before. Many times at desolate locations throughout the beautiful but unforgiving Texas frontier, whole villages, families, and farmsteads were simply wiped out. The Comanche had, for centuries, suffered the slings and arrows of oppression at the hands of the more organized, wealthier, and simply more fortunate tribes. Their ascension had come only with their introduction to the horse, via the raiding of and trading with the Spanish. However, once this serendipitous meeting had occurred, the Comanche's rise to power happened with perhaps more intensity and more rapidity than had ever been seen by any tribe on the North American continent before. The Comanche mastered horsemanship, horse trading, horse stealing, and were one of the few tribes to selectively breed the animals. Unlike most tribes that American or Mexican forces had encountered up to this point in 1841, the Comanche also fought from horseback. Raids often took place on full moon nights, an occurrence that became so frequent that a full moon in central Texas became known as a Comanche moon. Unsuspecting settlers or villagers from rival tribes would awake to a cyclone of violence and terror that few would live to tell about. Mounted Comanche warriors who had made their way from base camps sometimes hundreds of miles away would suddenly swoop down on their targets, seeking to take all they could and kill anyone who might try to stop them. All men would generally be killed on sight, or else taken prisoner and summarily tortured to death as equal parts retribution and entertainment. Women would be taken prisoner and generally be used as slaves, both sexual and otherwise. Infants would, in general, be killed outright as their crying and constant need for care presented too much of a liability and inconvenience for a raiding party on the move to trouble themselves with. This pattern had been repeated ad nauseum for decades, and, for the most part, no one had been able to do anything about it. The masterful general and politician Juan Bautista de Anza had managed to broker a peace with the Comanche in New Mexico in the late 18th century, but it had not extended to the Texas frontier. The Spanish government had been long exasperated by its inability to settle any consequential amount of territory north of San Antonio since the city's founding in 1718. They had seen their soldiers and settlers, as well as their priests and missions, fall victim time and again to levels of violence that they had never encountered before. The Mexican government that had taken power after the signing of the Treaty of Cordoba in 1821 had found themselves just as perplexed as their predecessors on how to stem the tide of Comanche violence. In the Comanche, they had found not so much another native tribe to be either exterminated or driven out, but a rival empire with whom they had found themselves perpetually unable to compete. The seasonal attacks caused not only intermittent destruction, but a pervasive fear amongst the citizens of Mexico from San Antonio all the way to the Yucatan Peninsula. The Mexican government's solution was to install a buffer zone of Anglo settlers on the Texas frontier to absorb the brunt of the Comanche violence and hopefully spare their citizenry further south such troubles. But this solution was found wanting when the settlers, thoroughly fed up with the lack of support from the Mexican government, began to foment a spirit of rebellion amongst the settler population in Texas. This became a significant contributing factor in the Texians' ultimate rebellion against the Mexican government, which resulted in the Texas Revolution lasting from October 2, 1835 to April 21, 1836. The Texians would ultimately win their independence from the Mexican government, only to find themselves facing an even bigger challenge in stemming the tide of Comanche attacks that bedeviled virtually the entirety of the territory, from the Gulf of Mexico to present-day Oklahoma. Their solution was to employ mobile companies of light cavalry who would police the open ranges of the Texas frontier. This was the genesis of the Texas Rangers. To be sure, the concept of ranging companies was not a wholly new one, even in the 1840s. The term ranger traces its etymology back to the 1590s, in which it initially described a rover or wanderer. However, the term had evolved by the 1660s to describe a mounted man or force of men who policed a large area of land. Even in their earliest iterations, the Texas Rangers sparked a nerve in the collective consciousness of the time, lending themselves to great tales of daring and do recounted from newspapers and dime novels in parlor rooms as far away as New York and London. But for all their vaunted martial prowess, the Rangers had, at least at first, struggled greatly. Their ranks were composed mostly of young men in their early 20s, many of whom had come to Texas for the express purposes of fighting, killing, combat, and adventure. They had fought and killed Mexican troops and citizens alike, chased down and brutally punished cattle thieves and murderers, and instilled their brand of frontier justice wherever they had seen fit. But of all their enemies, of whom there were many, it was the Comanche who had inflicted the greatest losses upon their already small ranks. In some of the earliest years of combating the Comanche, the Ranger fatality rate was recorded as being up to 50%. Those not fortunate enough to be killed outright were subjected to torturous fates. However, those who had survived had continued to hone their skills as a mobile attack force that could strike deep into enemy territory. They had seen their friends and comrades die in horrific ways in remote locations, with few to remember that they ever existed, and they were loath to let the lessons that they had learned from this go unused. They had continued to refine their techniques in riding and shooting, developing and drilling new recruits in shooting on the move from atop a galloping horse. They had developed their weaponry, moving from single-shot pistols to 5-shot revolvers with reloadable cylinders. The selective effect of consistent, intensive combat inevitably culled the already stalwart Ranger forces into a Spartan-esque group of highly experienced and highly motivated frontier killers. Though they were certainly held in high esteem by the Texas settlers and citizens they were charged with protecting, the Texas Rangers in 1841 were known as rough men who, without the outlet of their profession, would have found no place in civilized society. The Rangers had no formalized uniform, nor any code of grooming or dress. They wore whatever they pleased and found most practical in the Texas weather and terrain. Oftentimes, the average ranger might wear buckskin leggings with a cotton shirt and a wide-brimmed hat. Still others might wear a serape and coonskin cap. They were often not terribly concerned with record-keeping, journaling, nor the popular literature of the day. They were known to intermittently fight and kill each other with their bowie knives and revolvers in drunken quarrels. They were, by most accounts, more analogous to a modern-day biker gang than anything resembling a metropolitan police force today. Many had unkempt hair, long beards, and spoke coarsely. It was no small wonder, then, that they pledged their seemingly unwavering allegiance and obedience to a well-kempt, high-voiced, and slightly built Tennessean who was scarcely 24 years old. His name was John Coffee Hayes, better known as Jack Hayes. He had been born in Little Cedar Lick, Tennessee, into a proud military family. His father, Harmon A. Hayes, had fought under Andrew Jackson in the War of 1812. He had given his son the middle name Coffee after John R. Coffee, a family relative and an officer at the Battle of New Orleans. He had made his way to Texas in 1836 in hopes of participating in the Texas Revolution, but, having arrived too late to do so, had found work as a land surveyor instead. This was perhaps the most dangerous job in the territory at the time. It involved venturing out into the vast expanses of the seemingly empty, seemingly unclaimed spaces of the Texas frontier to demarcate boundaries of land plots ostensibly belonging to their new republic. But, as everyone in Texas well knew, the territories west of San Antonio and the new capital of Austin were neither empty nor unclaimed. This land belonged to an empire that, at its height, dwarfed the size and scope of anything the Texans could legitimately lay claim to. It belonged to the Comanche, and it was known as Comancheria. To set foot in these territories without explicit permission of the Comanche was to put one's life in very real, very immediate danger. The Comanche had long observed survey parties sent out by the Spanish and Mexicans and knew what their purpose and intentions were. These were the men who snuck into their lands to divvy them up and sell them off to the Comanche's hated enemies. Thus, many a surveyor met his ends staked out to the Texas dirt, as Comanche warriors heaped burning coals upon his stomach and mocked his cries of pain and torment. Hayes, however, had been undeterred by the risks. He had been recruited into the Ranger forces for both his demonstrable traits as well as his military pedigree, and worked his way up through their ranks in short order. While stationed near San Antonio, Hayes had become good friends with a Lipan Apache chief named Flaco. In their many conversations, Flaco had demonstrated in detail the tactics of the Comanche as opposed to other tribes such as the Apache or Waco. The Comanche attacked in cyclonic formations that saw a ring of riders rotate its way towards their target. Every time a warrior reached the point in his rotation where he was nearest the target, he would loose his arrow before his path continued to carry him to the rear of the formation, granting him time to reload and strike again on his next turn. Hayes employed Chief Flaco often in hunting down raiding parties and used the invaluable intel he had gathered from the chief in combating the Comanche on their own terms in their own territory. His reputation had grown not only amongst the Texians and Mexicans, but amongst the Comanche as well. They deemed him heap brave and referred to him as Captain Jack, which they pronounced Cap'n Yak, or bravo too much, meaning too brave. Many a bounty had been placed on his head by Comanche war chiefs and Mexican officers, who described him as an irascible devil. The accounts of friends and foes alike describe Hayes's normally affable, genteel manner, which seemed instantly transformed at the first call to arms. His dark eyes would become icy cold. His posture would become all at once commanding, and his distinctive, high-toned voice would become crystal clear and calm in doling out orders whose consequences would result in the men under his command living or dying. He was described as intensely concerned with the well-being of his men, but nearly suicidal in his disregard of his own, as arrows and bullets flew, shrieks rang out, and bodies fell all around him. These traits had garnered the young man not only the accolades of promotion within the Ranger ranks, but the unwavering loyalty of those in his charge. And so it was on this hot summer morning, as Hayes led his band of Rangers and Mexican gunmen in their pursuit of their mutual enemy. Leaving San Antonio, the party makes their way west, tracking the raiding party to the mouth of Uvalde Canyon, just over 80 miles from San Antonio. On July 1st, they finally come within sight of the Comanche. Knowing that time is of the essence if they are to maintain the ever-critical element of surprise, Hayes and his men make an immediate attack on the band of Comanches, roughly a dozen strong. The Comanche, for all their prowess in offense, often let discretion be the better part of valor in the face of surprise attacks. This case is no exception, as the Comanche warriors, along with one of their women, scatter into a nearby thicket. Hayes, leading the attack, brings his horse to a stop, while seemingly simultaneously stepping off the animal's back and charging into the thicket without breaking stride. Two of Hayes's ranger comrades do the same, and the three men pursue their quarry headlong into the dense thicket. A volley of arrows flies towards them, with most of them sticking into tree trunks or bouncing off of limbs. They are, however, effective enough in deterring the Rangers' attack, as all three men are hit. One of the men is grievously wounded, the other seriously wounded but still mobile, and Hayes has suffered a painful but comparatively minor wound to one of his fingers. Hayes directs the most seriously wounded Ranger to take cover as best he can, while he gets their more mobile comrade to the comparative safety of their battle line. Hayes manages to do this, then returns to the thicket with a double-barreled shotgun in order to retrieve his more critically wounded Ranger cohort. Of the 12 Comanche warriors in the thicket, only one is armed with a rifle, the rest being armed with bows, arrows, tomahawks, and knives. Against one wounded man with a shotgun and another nearly dead man with a pistol, this would normally be an unremarkable challenge for the Comanche, even within the restrictive confines of the thicket. Incensed at the Rangers' rude interruption, the Comanche gather into a battle line and begin their attack, ripping through the limbs and brush, intending to swoop down on Hayes's position and end this troublesome, arrogant Texian once and for all. Jack Hayes, however, intends to kill all the Comanche he can, and, should they not kill him, get his wounded comrade to safety. He waits an agonizingly long several seconds until the Comanche charge is within 15 feet of he and his fellow Ranger's position, before suddenly rising and coolly squeezing off shotgun blasts into the two closest warriors. Then, with the second shot still ringing in the air, Hayes drops the shotgun to the ground and draws his revolver. However, the two shots from the shotgun, as well as the visual of the damage done to their comrades, has been enough to dissuade the Comanches from their assault. This provides Hayes the proverbial window he needs to drag his fellow Ranger to safety. He directs the men not caring for the wounded to encircle the thicket and shoot any Comanche who attempts to flee. Hayes then obtains a rifle and several freshly loaded cylinders for his revolver, before sprinting back into the thicket, alone. Hayes hunkers down into the same position he had left, with the stench of blood and gun smoke still heavy in the air. For the next 3 hours, Hayes proceeds to pick off the Comanche, one by one, as attack after attack is made only to be driven back by the accuracy and rapidity of Hayes's fire. Finally, As the late afternoon sun begins its languid descent into the west, there are only 2 men left alive in the thicket, Hayes and a Comanche warrior, as well as 1 Comanche woman. 10 of the Comanche's fellow tribesmen with whom they had traveled so far and only this morning shared the warmth of their campfire and comfort of a good meal with, now lie strewn about this isolated thicket, their lifeblood drained into the caliche dirt. The last Comanche warrior, knowing he is surrounded and escape is all but impossible, resigns himself to his fate. He sings his death song, which echoes off the canyon walls in haunting refrains. The warrior then steals his mind, informs the lone woman left with him that she will be taken prisoner soon and that she must conduct herself honorably and stay strong under the cruel yoke of the Texian intruders. Then he takes a deep breath, nocks one of his arrows, and begins to maneuver his way towards Hayes' position, intent on at least taking his pound of flesh from the Texians before entering the next world. Hayes, now sweat-soaked and covered in dust and blood, has been waiting. Though he has managed to kill all 10 of this warrior's comrades, he knows the fight is not over until either all of the Comanche are dead or he is. Again, Hayes hunkers down as the thudding of footsteps and crashing of limbs nears his position. Finally, when the last warrior comes within 15 feet of his position, Hayes rises and takes aim. This time, though, he does not manage to get off a shot before his enemy. The Comanche looses his arrow at the same instant Hayes' revolver sends out a cacophonous retort. The arrow whips through the air, grazing Hayes' shoulder and knocking him to his back. The Comanche warrior is struck in the torso, but continues his attack, knife in hand. Hayes manages to pounce to his feet, and with the warrior mere feet away, empty his remaining 4 shots into the Comanche, ending his last fight for good. The woman is taken prisoner, the horses recovered, and the Comanche's bodies left to the desecrations of the wolves and coyotes. Hayes would go on to many more fights with not only the Comanche, but with the Mexican army, the Apache, and even the Paiute. He would ultimately move to San Francisco, where he would be named sheriff and amass a substantial fortune via ranching and real estate. Until his dying day, he would retain the respect of many of his staunchest former enemies, so much so that, upon hearing of the birth of Hayes' first son, the Comanche chief Buffalo Hump sent the ranger captain a golden spoon as a gift for his new baby. Hayes would go on to become one of the original members of the city of Oakland. He would ultimately pass away at the age of 66 and is buried at the Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California. The Comanche, though they had borne the brunt of this particular engagement, would go on to expand their empire, living as lords of the southern plains until the 1870s, when they were finally relegated to the doldrums, discontent, and perpetual disrespect of reservation life. The fight for Texas, perhaps more so than any territory in the whole of North America, was a bloody, unforgiving, grief-soaked, and violence-driven affair. The tales of triumph, tragedy, hopes gained, and lives lost are too numerous to cover in one episode. And while all are tales worth remembering, for tonight, they are other stories for other times. May 12, 1858, Western Oklahoma. A Comanche chief drifts in and out of sleep as dawn approaches, comfortably ensconced with his family inside their sizable and surprisingly temperate lodge. The morning cooking fires have not yet been started, and most in the camp are wrapped snugly in buffalo hide blankets. Most, perhaps even this chief, are just now starting to wake. The sun is just starting to peek over the eastern horizon, sending mesmerizing shimmers of light across the rippling waters of the nearby stream. This band of Comanche are known as the Quahati or Antelope Eaters, and this territory, encompassing large swaths of present-day Oklahoma and northern Texas, is their hard-won and much beloved home. They feel safe here, an even more elusive state over the past few years, as the pace and scope of Texas settlement had increased to never-before-seen levels. In response, the Comanche raids that had plagued the territory for decades now had reached a level of frequency and ferocity that few in Texas had ever seen before. Countless homesteads all along the edge of the Texas frontier, in river valley bottoms and rolling farmsteads, and even comparatively large cities like San Antonio and Austin, had seen the horrors and felt the wrath of the Comanche raiding machine. From Oklahoma to northern Mexico, the Comanche had cut a swath of violence that had stalled settlement for decades. Even with settlers who had grown up on the frontiers of Kentucky, Arkansas, and Virginia, where life was hard and threat of violence from native tribes was always a very real danger, Comanche raids were a world apart from what they were used to. Comanche raids entailed the killing of any and all fighting-age males, the institutionalized sexual abuse of female captives, the killing of infants or any burdensome prisoners, and the ritualized torture of any combatants who had managed to survive the fight. This had played itself out countless times, with numerous families being wiped out, countless family members being taken onto the frontier never to be seen again, and entire townships being abandoned, seemingly overnight, in panicked retreats to avoid further Comanche raiding. Perhaps one of the most bizarre and presumably unsettling sights these survivors reported seeing was that of a Comanche chief adorned not in just a headdress and war paint, but in an armored steel breastplate. The breastplate was that of a Spanish conquistador, a piece of armor that would have seemed nearly as anachronistic to 19th century settlers as it would be to us today. The popular legend was that it had been taken from a dead conquistador after a hard-fought, lonely battle somewhere on the desolate frontier had proven to be his last. It may very well have been traded for or acquired from another tribe, one of the many who had been driven off or all but eliminated by the Comanche, as part of the spoils of their victory. Though the origins remained dubious, its effect in contemporary combat and raiding was undoubted. Not only did the chief, known as Puhihitswa, or Iron Jacket, present a terrifying figure, he was afforded at least some measure of protection from small arms fire. His reputation within the tribe had grown through his successful recruitment and leading of raiding parties and the acquisition of horses and prisoners. It was, in fact, widely believed that Iron Jacket's armor made him invincible to the bullets of the Americans, Texans, and Mexicans. This band had been raiding the Texas countryside around what is today Brownwood, Texas. They had struck swiftly, killed many settlers whose names are now lost to history, wrought their usual havoc, and made off for their home country, some 300 miles to the north. Iron Jacket and his fellow Quahati felt safe this far away from the white settlements. They believed they were now so far onto the prairies, they were safe from any Texan attempts at reprisal. This appraisal of the situation is understandable, as the rolling, open grasslands of the Great Plains had proven such a formidable barrier against any consequential expansion for so long. The plains were featureless to the layman's eye and seemingly bereft of any usable resources to the uninitiated. This is not to say that the occasional pursuit of Comanche raiders had not been made far into the open grasslands, but, more often than not, they had ended with the pursuers either killed by the Comanche or lost, stranded, and left to die of hunger and thirst in a seemingly endless ocean of land. But in the midst of all the raiding and turmoil, the Texans had been learning. More specifically, the Texas Rangers had been learning. They had been fighting the Comanche for decades now, and presented some of the only substantial resistance to the lords of the southern plains. They had been founded on October 17th of 1835 as a sort of hybrid force of military and law enforcement meant to combat raids from bandits, Mexican army forces, and, most notably, Comanche raiding parties. In the intervening decades between then and 1858, they had made extraordinary leaps in their skills, tactics, administration, and public relations. And, conversely, during this time, they had taken several sizable steps backward in virtually all of these areas. Their casualty rates often ranged near 50%. They were perpetually underfunded, either vilified or lionized in all popular publications, and had disbanded entirely and then reformed more than once. Now, the newly elected Texas governor Hardin Richard Runnels, under pressure to make good on his campaign promises of putting a stop to the incessant bloodshed on the Texas frontier, had directed a force of rangers to pursue any and all known hostile native forces. On January 28th of 1858, Governor Runnels sent his official dispatch to his hand-picked ranger captain, the legendary John Salmon "Rip" Ford. It read, "I impress upon you the necessity of action and energy. Follow any trail and all the hostiles or suspected hostile Indians you may discover, and, if possible, overtake and chastise them if unfriendly." Ford had expected the directive for some time now, and he was quite ready. Though he had spent much of the previous 6 years in pursuit of political and entrepreneurial pursuits, Ford was an experienced, battle-hardened, and classically educated Ranger veteran. He had been born in South Carolina in 1815, grown up in Tennessee, and moved to Texas in 1836. He had studied law, practiced medicine, and ridden with the Texas Mounted Rifles in the Texas Revolution. He had joined the Texas Rangers in the 1840s, ridden with legendary fighters like Bigfoot Wallace, Ben and Henry McCulloch, Matthew Old Paint Caldwell, and Jack Coffee Hayes. He had participated in some of the most violent encounters on the entirety of the American frontier, losing a finger in a fight against the Comanches and barely surviving more than a few times. He had acquired the name Rip during the Mexican War, where he served as a lieutenant and medical officer. In charge of notifying family members of the deaths of their beloved servicemen, Ford's repeated signing of RIP or RIP and the postscript of his official signature garnered him the unfortunate moniker. In recent years, he had made his home in Austin and was known as a devout Sunday school teacher, newspaper publisher, and sometime playwright. But after the harrowing summer of 1857, he had now found himself called upon again to fight the Comanche. Ford and his ranger contingent had wintered at Fort Belknap, northwest of modern-day Dallas. Here, they had trained in the rapid-fire tactics that would be their only hope on the vast expanses of what was then known as Comancheria. Rip Ford had been hired to reinstill some of the institutional knowledge that had been lost since the days of Jack Hayes and his lightning-fast, seemingly fearless head-on attacks. Many young rangers had died hard deaths in the intervening years, falling prey to Comanche tactical traps such as feigned retreats or being caught and unfortunately killed in masterfully planned and horrifically violent ambushes. While Ford made his rangers combat ready at the fort, a trusted Tonkawa scout named Kichi ventured out into the open expanses of the Northwest. Scouting for the Comanche, the rangers had been commissioned to hunt down and engage. It is often overlooked, yet an undeniable fact, that without the native scouts, all but the most inveterate, trail-savvy frontiersmen would have been essentially hapless in their attempts at trailing the natives that they pursued. Such was the case here, as the ranger captain waited pensively for the return of Kichi and prayed that he had good news to report. In April, Kichi returned to the fort, bringing with him the news that Ford had been hoping for. He had found a village far to the northwest. They were hunting near the Canadian River, and if the rangers left immediately, they might stand a chance of apprehending them. On April 22nd, Ford and his rangers had made their way out of the relative safety of the fort and followed the Brazos River northwest. Their initial force upon leaving the fort consisted of 102 men, 2 wagons, a field ambulance wagon, and 15 pack mules. They marched to Cottonwood Springs, where their forces were augmented by Captain Shapley T. Ross and his force of 113 native warriors, mostly from the Tonkawa, Waco, Shawnee, Delaware, and Tawakoni tribes, all of whom had suffered dearly and recently due to Comanche raiding. On the 29th of April, they crossed the Red River. This meant they were now operating outside the official jurisdiction of Texas, and now venturing into what was known as Indian country. The Rangers and their allies all traveled light as a general rule while on the trail. Sundries and rations were often eschewed in favor of more ammunition and weapons. This meant that substantial portions of their daily caloric intake came from the game they were able to hunt along the way. Deer and rabbit were common fare, but buffalo was most prized, and in 1858, most plentiful. On May 10th, some of the scouts who had killed a buffalo noticed that Comanche arrowheads were lodged in its flesh. Though it had fallen to these scouts' efforts, this animal had recently, narrowly, escaped becoming food for the Comanche. This meant the Comanche were close. Scouts were sent to fan out across the countryside in hopes of spotting where the Comanche were hunting. The camp of Rangers and native warriors now sensed the fight was close. They waited with bated breath as the scouts conducted their reconnaissance. The scouts returned with news that they had spotted a Comanche hunting party and trailed them to the camp on the Canadian River. Now, they had to move fast before the Comanche discovered them. As Iron Jacket slept in his warm lodge only a few miles away, Rip Ford roused his Rangers and native forces from their fitful sleeps in yet another cold camp. As they checked their weapons and saddled their horses, the native warriors among them wrapped their heads in strips of white cloth in order to dissuade any potential friendly fire from overzealous Texans. Kichi, their revered scout, had reported there to be 2 villages, one smaller and composed of 5 lodges. The second, much larger village was across the river and composed of about 350 warriors, not including the women and children. The Rangers and their native allies then broke camp, leaving the 2 wagons, the field ambulance, and pack mules under the care of a guard commanded by Ford's 73-year-old father, Captain William Ford. The force rode 6 miles in the dark, making their way to the small villages first. At 7 a.m., the chaos and killing began. The initial charge was made, with the Rangers and their allies pouring into the village, killing any warriors they could. 2 Comanche had escaped, however, and were now riding hard for the larger village across the river, some 3 miles away. Ford and his Rangers and most of their native allies continued the chase, intending to cut down the fleeing Comanche before they could alert the larger village. Many of the Tonkawas, though, stopped. Of all the native peoples in the multicultural contingent, the Tonkawas had perhaps the longest standing and most deeply rooted hatred for the Comanche. For decades now, they had borne the brunt of the Comanche incursion into central Texas and lost many of their friends and family members to Comanche atrocities. While the Rangers and most of their allies rode on, many Tonkawa looted, burned, and killed any Comanche that they could. As the screams of the first village faded behind them, Ford and his remaining forces slogged across the Canadian River. Many had to dismount, and some even became stranded afoot after losing their horses. They were left to chase their mounted comrades, all in a desperate race to hit the Comanche camp before the Comanche camp could mount a defense and counterattack. But, much to their dismay, the 2 Comanche who had fled the smaller camp were indeed able to make it to the larger camp in time to warn their people of what was happening. Iron Jacket had likely been warming himself next to his morning campfire when the 2 Comanche came barreling into the camp, screaming and pleading for help. There would have been no time to waste, as the chief gathered his weapons, ordered his children to help his wives making the camp ready to move, and then donned his prized Spanish armor. Then, he and his fellow warriors were off, riding out of the village at full speed with the intent to not only thwart the Ranger attack, but to kill any and all that they could. The Rangers' native allies had beaten them to the village by a few hundred yards, and thus were the first to receive the Comanche reprisal attack. For all their vaunted martial superiority, though, on this day, the Comanche were unaware of a particular advantage held by the white headband-adorned Wacos, Shawnee, Delaware, Tawankoni, and remaining Tonkawa. They had been equipped with repeating rifles and 6-shot revolvers. While this may have been a safe assumption when attacking any ranger force in 1858, it was a shock to many of the Comanche that the natives riding with the rangers had also been complementarily endowed with such formidable firepower. As the rangers closed the ground between themselves and their allies as quickly as possible, Ford and his lieutenants exhorted them to shoot the oncoming Comanche. A volley was soon poured into the Comanche forces from the native allies, and Iron Jacket and his horse fell dead. This left the remaining Comanche warriors in a momentary shock, as most among their band truly believed Iron Jacket to be invincible from bullets when clad in his famous armor. But this had not proven the case. Confused and momentarily defeated, the surviving Comanche dashed back to their village. As they made their way back to the village, however, they were greeted by Ford's rangers, who came smashing into the village at full force. Amid the din and chaos of screams and gunfire, Ford's rangers would recall him as cool and collected. Ford did his best to exert some measure of direction to the chaos unfolding, but the fight soon devolved into a smattering of smaller, individual combats playing themselves out over a vast 18-square-mile stretch of land. After a few hours of this brutal but sporadic fighting, the Rangers reconvened at the Comanche village. Ford hoped to size up the situation, take stock of his forces, and make away with what loot they could before a Comanche counterattack could be mounted. At the village, however, Ford found Captain Shapley Ross, the initial nominal commander of the native allies who had joined the Rangers on the Brazos River, marshaling their allies into a battle line. A Comanche counterattack, Ross insisted, was coming sooner rather than later. Appraising his forces, Ford noticed 2 of his newest, youngest Rangers, Privates Oliver Searcy and Robert Nichols, were unaccounted for. Almost as suddenly as their absence was noted, though, Oliver Searcy came running breathlessly into camp. In between gulps of air, he informed his commander that he and Nichols had been amongst the Rangers who had abandoned their mounts in the quagmire of the Canadian River's thick, encompassing mud. Footbound and still raging for a fight, the young Rangers had missed the initial volley that had felled the great Iron Jacket, but had chased after the retreating Comanche as they fled to the northwest. But, as so often happened on the frontier, pursuing young Rangers soon found themselves surrounded by Comanche warriors, cut off from retreat. Nichols and Searcy had made a mad dash for a set of ravines near the river, turning and firing when they could to check the advances of their Comanche pursuers. Nichols, however, was overrun and killed. Bled out at the end of Comanche lances, Searcy had managed to reach the ravine and evade the Comanche within its labyrinthian confines. He had dashed his way back into camp after hiding for a time and was severely shaken, both mentally and physically. But while Oliver Searcy's fighting was done for the day, the Comanche retaliation had only just begun. Almost as soon as Searcy's warnings of Comanche being close behind him had time to reach the ears of every man in camp, Captain Ross spotted a group of mounted Comanche warriors coming towards them. They were led by a large, powerfully built young warrior. His name was Nocona, and he was the son of Iron Jacket and a much respected and well-known warrior himself. As Nocona and his warriors deftly maneuvered their ponies through a thicket on the side of the bank sloping down toward the river, Ross convened with Ford and his native forces as to what their next move might be. Ross was worried the Comanche, under the leadership of this new, younger chief, might be able to secure a position on the high ground behind the Rangers' new captured campsite. However, he was resolutely informed by one of his Tonkawa scouts that he needed to fear not. The scout then mounted his horse and rode, with only spear and shield in hand, into the open ground between the Comanche and Ranger positions. What happened next seemed nearly as unbelievable to the Rangers present as a scene from medieval antiquity. The lone Tonkawa began shouting taunts at the Comanche force up on the ridge. He said, "We have nothing to fight for. We have some of your women and children captives. Also, we have your wigwams, your buffalo meat, and your horses. You come down. You have something to fight for." For over half an hour, the Comanche and native allies of the Rangers engaged in one-on-one taunting battles, followed by charges and bouts of hand-to-hand combat between warriors clashing on horseback. This clash presented not only a unique sight, however, it was also a tactical break that Ford needed. He commanded a detachment commanded by Lieutenant Allison Nelson to flank the Comanche position and cut off any routes of retreat that they might have had. Ford then had the native ally forces recalled to the village in hopes of marshaling his forces for an all-out frontal assault on the Comanche position. However, this, as much of the rest of Ford's plan thus far, did not go entirely as he intended. A force of bloodthirsty Tonkawa could not be detained, and their premature attack alerted Pecos and his Comanche to the Rangers' intentions. With the Comanche intention of drawing attention towards themselves and enabling what was left of their wives and children to escape being accomplished, Pecos now saw no need to stand and fight any further. He led his forces on a retreat over the rolling hills with the Tonkawas in hot pursuit. Ford, meanwhile, was informed by a captured Comanche woman that an even bigger camp lay a number of miles away, under the command of the famed and feared Buffalo Hump. This would likely be Pecos and the other survivors' destination, and a much larger, much deadlier counterattack would likely come soon. Now, seeing a tactical egress to Texas territory as his most prudent option, Ford ordered the prisoners, 16 in total, shackled, the wounded placed on the ambulance, and waited as the Tonkawa pursuers straggled into camp one by one. As they did, Ford noticed their horses laden down with Comanche hands, feet, and strips of flesh, all strapped to their mounts and flapping in the wind. Such was the deep hatred that fueled warfare on the plains. In all, 76 Comanche had been killed, with Ford losing only the young Ranger Nichols and a young Waco warrior who had been lanced by his Comanche opponent in the one-on-one battles. On May 13th, the force of Rangers and native allies began their trek, wounded and prisoners in tow, back to the Brazos Agency. The force arrived on May 20th to widespread acclaim as a successful manifestation of the governor's new policies, but the war was far from over. Buffalo Hump and Pecos would soon be riding roughshod over the entirety of the southern plains. Their retribution would be swift, harsh, and all-encompassing. Nakona would go on, in fact, to marry a kidnapped white woman named Cynthia Ann Parker. Together, the couple would have 3 children, one of which would become the legendary last chief of the Comanche people, Quanah Parker. But for tonight, those are other stories for other times. Central Texas, 1870, near the town of Dripping Springs. As the blistering sun beats down upon them, a small group of Texas Rangers make their way through the limestone-strewn meadows and patches of oak and cedar. Though the heat is repressive, neither the Rangers nor their mounts seem unduly affected. As they ride, the Rangers' eyes are veritably glued to the ground, searching for any sign of their quarry having passed through these parts. They have been alerted that a band of Comanches, the universally feared lords of the southern plains, have been raiding local ranches, stampeding and killing livestock, and making off with a number of their horses. Though their veritable empire had been long in the state of retraction, the mighty Comanche are still an incessant and very dangerous threat here on the Texas frontier, roughly 25 miles west of the capital of Austin. In command is Captain Rufus Perry, a longtime ranger and veteran of countless engagements with the Comanche. Born in Alabama in 1822, Perry had migrated west to Bastrop, Texas, with his family in 1833. He had participated in the siege at Behar and fought alongside Ranger legends such as Samuel Walker, Bigfoot Wallace, Henry and Ben McCulloch, and Jack Hayes. At 48 years old, he is the eldest and most experienced in the group by a substantial margin. Most in this contingent of little more than 24 are scarcely over the age of 22. Amongst the youngest of these men is one Frank Payne, a native of Austin, Texas, who is scarcely in his late teens. However, despite his age, Payne, too, is a veteran of at least one encounter with the dreaded and deadly Comanche. In 1866, at roughly the age of 12 or 13 years old, the young man had accompanied his father and several other local men on what was known as a cow hunt, or an effort to scour the countryside west and northwest of Austin in order to round up any strays that may have wandered into the natural labyrinth created by the many creek beds and canyons. Even in 1866, this was still considered a reasonably dangerous task, as roving bands of Comanche only a few miles outside of town were still not an altogether uncommon occurrence. However, it had still been deemed a safe enough adventure to the young Frank Payne's father to allow his young son to participate, albeit only to observe from a distance. After making their way northwest of the city of Austin, the small party found themselves atop one of the many limestone cliffs that overhang the meadows and creeksides of the Texas Hill Country. While making their way along the ridgeline of a small canyon, they spotted a small group of Comanche engaged in what seemed to be a long-awaited feast. The following is an excerpt from A.J. Soul's Early Settlers and Indian Fighters in Southwest Texas. The white men at once made preparations to attack them, and drew back under cover and held a council. They did not wish to let the Indians escape without a fight, but Mr. Payne was concerned about his young son Frank for fear that he would get hurt. The boy was about 12 years of age and was not carrying any arms. The elder Payne finally told his son to remain where he was and not to leave the spot until the fight was over, and some of them came back for him. Loath to waste the rare occasion of catching a group of Comanche off guard, the attack was made at once, with the skilled ranchers making their way down the steep embankments in short order to engage the unwitting Comanche. Soul's account of the event continues. These accounts now being agreed upon, the white men advanced and charged upon the Indians, who at once mounted their horses and fled. The whole party of whites and Indians were soon lost to sight of Frank across a low range of hills. The cowmen, being on good horses, soon came within pistol range and the fight commenced, the Indians giving shot for shot and war-whooping as they went. Young Payne, from his position in the rear, heard all this commotion and became very anxious to witness the combat. Accordingly, he put spurs to his pony and galloped to the top of the ridge where he could have a plain view, not intending to go any further. When he arrived at the crest of the elevation, however, he met a loose and terror-stricken horse coming out of the fight, and the boy's horse took fright at him and ran away, and instead of going back the way he came, ran straight ahead and followed into the wake of the Indians. The white men were scattered and one of them unhorsed, and the boy soon passed all of them and ran into the natives. Mr. Payne saw the peril his son was in, and when he passed, called out, "Hold up, Frank, hold up!" That was what the boy was trying to do with all of his strength, but the pony had the bit in his mouth and was beyond control. The Indians evidently thought this a daring and intentional charge on the part of the young white brave, and, yelling loudly, prepared to fight him. The boy passed some of the Indians, who shot at him and threw lances from all sides. Finally, a bullet, arrow, or lance cut his bridle rein in two. His horse then increased his speed and soon got clear of all the Indians. Frank now took the rope from the horn of his saddle and, making a lope, leaned forward and secured it over the nose of his horse, finally stopping him. In the meantime, the elder Payne had followed his son as fast as he could in order to try and save him, and fought his way through the Comanche, scattering the balance. Young Frank made a circle and came back. Besides having his bridle rein severed, 2 arrows were sticking into his saddle. Only one of the cow hunters was wounded. He was able to ride, and when his horse was brought back, he mounted, and the party arrived at home without further incident. Rather than be dissuaded from a life of hardship and violence with the Texas Rangers, the young man found his brush with death only briefly whetted his appetite for frontier adventure. Payne had signed on with the Rangers earlier in this year of 1870 and had been assigned to headquarters at a place known as Camp San Saba Springs, near present-day Coleman, Texas. After being alerted to the Comanche activity, the company has made their way south, now nearing a large hill located roughly 6 miles south of present-day Marble Falls, Texas, known as Shovel Mountain. As the contingent of Rangers, clothed in outfits suited to hill country practicality and armed to the hilt with Colt revolvers and repeating rifles, make their way around the base of the mountain, their ears are perked by the faint sound of a man's voice crying out in English. His words are indiscernible, but his plight is obvious, as his tone is that of a desperate and nearly hopeless man. Suddenly, just as Captain Rufus Perry is cautiously advancing his men around a bend in the trail, the alabaster silhouette of a nude white man catches even the most weary among them off guard. His eyes are wide, his mouth caked with dried saliva, and his once scarcely discernible cries now ring clear as a bell to the Rangers. veterans and neophytes alike. "Comanche! Comanche!" the man cries, as the war whoops of his pursuers can now be heard in a simultaneous instant. The mere word Comanche now speaks gravity of the situation at hand. The man runs headlong towards them, desperately flinging himself towards the thick of the Ranger formation as if he were a tired runner upon the final stretch of a race, finishing only with his last vestiges of effort and energy. Now, just as the unknown, unfortunate, and unclothed settler tumbles into the relative cover of their company, the Rangers are met with the daunting sight of several pursuing Comanche, incensed and incredulous at both the decades of encroachment and the spoiling of their raid. However, the pursuing warriors, now having spotted their pursuers, instantaneously draw their ponies to a halt and reverse course, seeking to drive their newly gotten horse herd west in an effort to escape, now that the proverbial hand of fate has turned them from hunter to hunted. The account from AJ's Soul continues. The Indians had 100 head of horses, and were going slow on account of the rough country. The Rangers now made a flank movement to the right, keeping under cover of the brush until near the horses, and then making a sudden dash to cut them off from the Indians in a narrow place. They ran them back south against the foot of Shovel Mountain and left 3 men to hold them there until the battle was over. The Rangers knew they would have to fight the Indians as they were in a large force and yelling loudly. It seems that during the excitement of running the settler, the Indians and horses had become scattered, and the Rangers, taking cover and coming out in an unexpected place by a bold, quick dash, had secured the horses. The Indians collected in plain view of the Rangers and began to divest themselves of blankets and outriggings and to pile them up on the ground. The Rangers now advanced and dismounted in a post oak ravine, tied their horses, and filled the magazines of their Winchesters full of cartridges and awaited the charge they saw the Comanches were about to make. The Indians numbered 125, as near as could be ascertained, and the Rangers 28, besides the 3 who were holding the herd of horses just behind the mountain. The Indians, when they did charge, made a turn and were caught in such a rapid fire that the savage warriors retreated back to their position. The 3 plucky Indians could not get to the horses without passing within gunshot of the position close to the Rangers, and a short but desperate fight took place. The Comanches, however, soon gave back before the galling fire of the Winchesters. They fought with muzzle-loading guns, bows, and lances. Captain Perry was a good Indian fighter and handled his men well. The Indians killed in this charge were carried off by daring fellows on horseback who would lean from the saddle and, taking them by their long hair, drag them back to cover. In the 3rd charge, the Indian chief was killed and his horse ran in among the Rangers with the dead body, which was held to the saddle by a strong strap of leather. If the horse had gone back the other way, the body of the chief would not have been captured. The Indians evidently overrated the force of Rangers on account of the number of shots fired. The Comanche finally left after suffering a heavy loss. The dress and rigging of the head chief were taken to Austin and placed in the Capitol building. 1 Ranger is killed during the brief but vicious engagement, a young man in his early 20s, identified as one of the 3 Cox brothers serving with the detachment at the time. His body is taken to the Bird Town Cemetery, where he is interred into the hardscrabble ground roughly 11 miles north of today's Johnson City. Frank Payne would continue his service with the Rangers throughout the 1870s, eventually marrying and fathering 5 children. The family would settle in Leakey, Texas, where Frank would pass away in 1900. Rufus Perry would continue his already legendary career with the Texas Rangers, participating in the Battle of Deer Creek in 1873, before eventually retiring from the Rangers in 1874. The tales of just Frank Payne and Rufus Perry alone are enough to fill countless episodes with their tales of bravery and brutality on the very bleeding edge of the Texas frontier. So too are the tales of both gallantry and gall from the mighty and merciless Comanche, perhaps the greatest empire builders on the North American continent until the late 19th century, when their way of life was sadly and abruptly brought to an end. But for tonight, those are other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking the Join button or click the link in the description below to become a member on Patreon. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.